Hey guys, tonight we are not just telling a story. We are stepping into a time machine, a dusty, slightly uncomfortable time machine that will whisk you back to a world so utterly alien, so fundamentally different from your own, you might just find yourself forgetting how to use a smartphone. Imagine, if you will, the scorching sun beating down on vast, fertile plains, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant bleating of sheep. You are there, a tiny speck in a bustling, ancient city, surrounded by towering ziggurats and mud brick homes. The sounds are a cacophony of human chatter, animal cries, and the rhythmic thump of grinding grain. You are not a king or a queen, not a priest or a warrior. You are, for tonight, an ordinary person trying to make sense of an extraordinary new world. You see, the very ground beneath your feet, the mud and straw that built these early civilizations, held the seeds of something revolutionary, something so commonplace today that you barely give it a second thought. But back then, it was a game changer, a concept so profound it helped shape the very fabric of society. And without it, frankly, you probably would not survive 5 minutes in this chaotic, prodigital landscape. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you are listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are a Sumerian. Not a king, not a priest, just a regular hard-working Sumerian. You wake with the sun, the soft glow filtering through the narrow opening in your mud brick home. The air is already warm, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the distant murmur of the awakening city. Your bed is a simple mat on the floor, your blanket a woven cloth. Life here, in the heart of Mesopotamia, is governed by the rivers, the mighty Tigris and Euphrates, whose annual floods bring both life-giving silt and unpredictable destruction. You know this instinctively, it is etched into your very being, a fundamental truth of existence in this fertile crescent. The rhythm of your days is dictated by agriculture. You are a farmer, perhaps, or a weaver, or a potter. Whatever your trade, it is intertwined with the collective effort of the community. You are part of a grand experiment, really, one of the earliest large-scale human settlements, a sprawling network of cities that would eventually become the cradle of civilization. And within this vibrant, growing world, something utterly new and essential is taking root, something you are about to become intimately familiar with. Your city is Uruk, a sprawling metropolis that, even by today's standards, would be considered impressive. Imagine a city covering thousands of acres, protected by massive walls, teeming with tens of thousands of people. It is a bustling, noisy place, a kaleidoscope of sights and sounds. You see men and women carrying baskets of grain, donkeys laden with pottery, children chasing each other through narrow alleys. The central ziggurat, a massive tiered temple, dominates the skyline, a testament to the city's devotion to its gods. It is a place of wonder and awe, a place where innovation is not a concept, but a daily necessity. The sheer density of population, the complex social structures emerging, the need to organize and manage resources on an unprecedented scale, all these factors are pressing in, demanding solutions. You feel this pressure, a subtle hum beneath the surface of daily life. It is the pressure of progress, the growing pains of a society learning to walk, then run. You might be heading to the temple, not for worship necessarily, but for work. The temple is not just a place of religious observance. It is the economic heart of the city, a massive redistribution center. This is a mainstream historical fact, the central role of temples in early Sumerian economies. It collects surplus produce from the farmers, stores it, and then distributes it to the craftspeople, the laborers, and the priests. It is a giant communal pantry, a city-wide cooperative. But how do you keep track of everything? How do you ensure that every farmer gets credit for their grain, every weaver for their cloth, every laborer for their toil? This is where things start to get a little tricky, a little muddled. Before long, you find yourself staring at a problem that seems insurmountable without some new kind of system. This is not just about fairness. It is about preventing chaos, about maintaining order in a society that is rapidly becoming more complex. Consider the quirks of this early economy. Did you know that early forms of payment could include barley, wool, or even fish? It was a truly diverse commodity-based system, a far cry from the standardized coinage you are used to. Imagine trying to buy a new tunic with a handful of live carp. It sounds a bit like a bad joke, right? A fish walks into a shop, tries to buy a shirt. The shopkeeper says, "Sorry, we only accept barley on Tuesdays." You can almost picture the confusion, the bartering, the endless arguments over the value of a bushel of dates versus a sheepskin. This system, while functional, was inherently inefficient and prone to disputes. It lacked a universal, verifiable method of tracking transactions. And that, my friend, is where the first seeds of the receipt, in its most rudimentary form, begin to sprout. Historians still argue whether the initial impetus for these accounting methods was purely economic or also deeply religious, tied to the temple's role as a divine administrator of resources. Was it purely about tracking grain? Or was there a spiritual dimension to ensuring fairness and accountability before the gods? You are standing in the bustling courtyard of the temple, the sun now high in the sky, casting long shadows. Around you, people are engaged in a flurry of activity. Scribes, distinguished by their slightly cleaner tunics, and perhaps a slightly less sun-beaten complexion, are moving about with an air of importance. They carry small, damp pieces of clay and strange-looking sticks. You watch, fascinated, as one of them presses the stick into the soft clay, making a series of wedge-shaped marks. It is a slow, deliberate process, each mark precise and meaningful. You do not understand what they are doing, not yet, but you sense its significance. It is something new, something powerful. It is the dawn of written communication, of record-keeping, born not of a desire to write epic poems or historical chronicles, but out of a much more practical, mundane need to track who owes what to whom. The very first records were not stories of heroes, but lists of beer and barley. Talk about setting the bar low or high, depending on your priorities. The need for this system is becoming increasingly apparent. You are part of a large irrigation project, digging canals to bring water from the river to the fields. It is back-breaking work, done under the relentless sun. You are promised a certain amount of barley for your labor. But how do you ensure that you receive your due? How does the temple, the central authority, know exactly how many workers were on the job, how much grain they are owed, and how much they have already received? This is not a small-scale operation, where a handshake and a good memory suffice. This is a monumental undertaking, involving hundreds, perhaps thousands of individuals. The sheer volume of transactions, the constant flow of goods and services, demands a system that is robust, reliable, and verifiable. It demands a record. And that, my wary friend, is precisely what you are witnessing being born. The birth of bureaucracy, in all its messy, glorious, and utterly essential forms. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from future accountants across the millennia. The air in the temple courtyard is thick with the dust of activity, a constant hum of human effort and the soft murmur of voices. You are still watching the scribes, their movements precise, almost ritualistic, as they press their styluses into the wet clay. It is not just about tracking barley anymore. You see them making marks that represent sheep, jars of oil, bolts of cloth. The range of commodities is vast, reflecting the diverse and growing economy of Uruk. The temple, acting as a central treasury and a vast storehouse, is managing an immense inventory. Imagine trying to run Amazon or a massive grocery store without a computer, without a barcode scanner, without even a paper ledger. That is the scale of the challenge the Sumerians were facing, and they were rising to meet it with ingenuity. They were building the very first information management system, piece by laborious piece out of mud and human intellect. This is not just a quirky tidbit, it is a profound testament to human innovation born of necessity. The concept of ownership itself is undergoing a transformation in this era. While communal ownership was still prevalent, especially concerning agricultural land, the rise of specialized labor and trade meant that individual possessions were becoming more defined. If you were a potter, the pots you made were yours, at least until they were exchanged. If you were a fisherman, your catch was your livelihood. This increasing individualization of goods and services, even within a largely communal system, created a greater need for clear documentation. You could not simply rely on a verbal agreement when hundreds of transactions were happening daily. Think of it like a giant, ancient Craigslist, but without the ability to screenshot anything. What a nightmare for dispute resolution. This is where the idea of an immutable record, something that could not be easily altered or denied, became crucial. The clay tablet, once inscribed and hardened by the sun or fire, was precisely that. It was durable, tangible, and, most importantly, difficult to forge without detection. It was the blockchain of the ancient world, only a lot heavier and less prone to speculative bubbles. Mainstream historical fact. The earliest forms of writing, cuneiform, developed from these pictographic and ideographic symbols used for accounting purposes. It was not born of poetry, but of practicality. The Sumerians were not just writing, they were building a tangible form of trust in a rapidly expanding economy. You could hold your receipt, even if it weighed a pound, and feel secure in your transaction. Historians still argue whether the initial development of these record-keeping systems was a top-down decree from the temple authorities, or a more organic evolution driven by the everyday needs of traders and farmers. Was it a grand, planned innovation, or a series of small, adaptive solutions that eventually coalesced into a comprehensive system? You can almost imagine an ancient Sumerian merchant, frustrated by a dispute over a load of grain, throwing up his hands and exclaiming, "There has to be a better way to prove this!" And perhaps, in that moment of exasperation, the seed of the receipt was truly planted. Regardless of its precise origin, its adoption was widespread because it solved a universal problem: how to remember, how to verify, how to prove. You might be wondering about the technology behind this. The stylus, typically a reed cut to a specific shape, allowed scribes to make the characteristic wedge-shaped marks that give cuneiform its name, wedge-shaped in Latin. The clay, readily available from the riverbanks, was shaped into small tablets, often palm-sized for ease of handling. It was a remarkably simple yet effective system, requiring no complex tools or rare materials. It was the original open-source solution, accessible to anyone who could master the tricky art of wet clay and sharp reeds. And the beauty of it was that once the clay dried, the record was permanent. Unless, of course, a clumsy apprentice dropped it, or a particularly zealous archaeologist unearthed it thousands of years later and had a Butterfingers moment. Imagine you are a baker and you supply bread to the temple daily. Each day, you deliver a certain number of loaves. Without a receipt, how do you prove how much you have delivered over a week or a month? How does the temple reconcile its records? You would be constantly squabbling, forever counting on fingers and toes, and probably losing sleep over whether you were being fairly compensated. This is where the receipt, even in its crudest form, becomes your best friend. It is your proof, your security, your peace of mind. It allows for systematic accounting, for the tracking of debits and credits, for the very concept of a balance sheet to emerge. Before this, accounting was probably more like guessing and hoping for the best, a true roll of the dice in the marketplace. The development of these early records was not just about economic transactions. It also facilitated the administration of justice. If there was a dispute over property or a debt, the clay tablet could serve as irrefutable evidence. It was the first written contract, the first legal document, the first testament to an agreement. It provided a framework for a more orderly society, reducing conflict and fostering trust, even if that trust was initially between a farmer and a temple, or a craftsman and a merchant. It was the foundation of what we now call the rule of law, a system where agreements could be recorded and enforced, rather than relying solely on oral tradition or brute force. That is a pretty big step for a small piece of clay, would you not agree? It turns out, papering over your problems, or claying over them, is surprisingly effective. The complexity of the Sumerian economy continued to grow. You have specialized craftsmen, agricultural workers, priests, soldiers, administrators. Each group has its own needs and its own contributions to the collective. The temple, as the central organizing body, has to manage this intricate web of interdependencies. It is not just about distributing grain. It is about allocating resources, managing labor, and even planning for future harvests. The receipts, or their ancient equivalents, are the data points that allow for this grand societal coordination. Without them, it would be a chaotic free-for-all, a constant struggle for resources, a society teetering on the brink of collapse. It is a testament to their foresight, or perhaps their desperate need, that they developed a system to handle such complexity. You can almost hear the sigh of relief from the temple accountants, who finally had something more reliable than their own memories to work with. You are now a seasoned observer of this burgeoning system, perhaps even a participant. You are at the bustling marketplace, a cacophony of vendors hawking their wares, the aroma of spices mingling with the scent of fresh bread and the earthy smell of pottery. You witness a transaction. A farmer brings a basket of ripe dates and in exchange receives a piece of woven cloth from a weaver. They haggle, as people always do, but once the price is agreed upon, a scribe is called over. This is a mainstream historical fact. Scribes were integral to these transactions, often acting as impartial record keepers. The scribe produces a small clay tablet, smooth and damp, and with their reed stylus, quickly etches the details: the farmer's name, the weaver's name, the quantity of dates, the type of cloth, and the date of the exchange. It is a simple record, yet profoundly significant. This little piece of clay is the ancestor of every receipt you have ever crumpled into your pocket. The concept of a witness also plays a crucial role here, further solidifying the trust in these early records. Often, a third party, an impartial observer, would be present during the inscription of the tablet, lending their authority to the authenticity of the record. This was a quirky or fringe tidbit, a subtle yet important layer of verification. It was not enough for the scribe to simply write it down. The presence of an independent witness added another layer of security, making it even harder to dispute the transaction later. Imagine trying to argue with a receipt that had a respected elder's thumbprint pressed into the clay beside the scribe's marks. That is some serious ancient accountability. It is like having a notarized receipt, but instead of a fancy stamp, it is a human being with a good reputation. Historians still argue whether the practice of having witnesses was a formal legal requirement from the outset, or evolved naturally as a way to enhance the credibility of the records. Was it a deliberate legal innovation, or a practical solution born from the need for greater trust in a world without widespread literacy? Regardless, it underscores the critical importance of verifiable documentation in a society rapidly moving beyond simple face-to-face bartering. The Sumerians understood that trust, while essential, could be strengthened by tangible proof. The very act of writing, of transcribing an ephemeral agreement into a permanent physical form, was a powerful development. Before this, your memory was your ledger, your word was your bond, and any disagreement often devolved into a shouting match, or worse. The clay tablet, however, offered a neutral, objective record. It transcended memory, emotion, and personal bias. It was the impartial arbiter, the silent witness that remembered everything. And in a society where disputes could easily escalate and disrupt the fragile balance of communal life, this was an invaluable tool for maintaining social order. It was the original "it's written down right here" argument, only a little more weighty than your average post-it note. You can see the convenience these records offer. No longer do you have to remember every single exchange, every single debt. The clay tablet does it for you. This frees up mental energy, allowing individuals to focus on their trades, their crafts, their contributions to the collective. It allows for specialization, for efficiency, for the complex division of labor that is the hallmark of an advanced civilization. It is a quiet revolution, happening one inscribed tablet at a time. This is not just about receipts. It is about the fundamental infrastructure of a complex society. It is the beginning of data management, long before anyone ever conceived of megabytes or cloud storage. Their cloud storage was literally the cloud of dust kicked up by their bustling economy. Consider the practicalities. The clay had to be prepared carefully, cleaned of impurities, and kneaded to the right consistency. Too dry, and it would crumble. Too wet, and the marks would blur. The scribes were skilled artisans in their own right, mastering not only the complex system of cuneiform signs, but also the delicate art of working with clay. It was a craft that required patience, precision, and a steady hand. These were not just clerks. They were the guardians of information, the keepers of the collective memory of the city. They were the original IT professionals, dealing with their own version of hardware and software, all made from earth. The development of numerical systems also went hand in hand with these early records. The Sumerians had a sexagesimal, or base 60 system, which is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. This is a mainstream historical fact. Their numerical system allowed for precise quantification of goods, making the accounting process even more accurate. You could not just say some barley. You could say 60 gur of barley, a unit of measurement. This precision was crucial for complex economic calculations and for ensuring fair exchanges. Imagine trying to do your taxes with just a vague idea of how much you earned. No thanks. The Sumerians were way ahead of that game, at least in terms of their accounting precision. And what about disputes? Before written records, how did you resolve a disagreement over a debt? It was likely through mediation, arbitration, or, in extreme cases, through force. With a clay tablet, however, you had objective evidence. You could present the tablet, and its marks would speak for themselves. This significantly reduced the potential for conflict and provided a clear path for resolving disputes within the established legal framework of the city. It was the first step towards a system of justice based on evidence, not just on who could shout the loudest or who had the biggest stick. It was a leap from the law of the jungle to something resembling a more organized, albeit still developing, legal system. You could almost hear the Sumerian equivalent of "show me the receipts" echoing through the ancient streets. You are now observing a more specialized aspect of this revolutionary record-keeping. Imagine yourself in the great temple storehouse, a vast cavern filled with clay jars, woven sacks, and neatly stacked bundles of raw materials. The air is cool and dusty, smelling of dried grains and spices. Here, the sheer volume of goods flowing in and out is staggering. This is where the receipt, in its various early forms, truly comes into its own as a management tool. Every incoming delivery, every outgoing distribution, must be meticulously recorded. A mainstream historical fact, the temple bureaucracy in Sumer was incredibly sophisticated, rivaling even some modern organizations in its complexity and administrative reach. They were managing the entire supply chain of an early urban economy. Consider the concept of stock management. Before these clay tablets, how did anyone know how much grain was left in the silo, or how many sheep were in the pens? It was a matter of visual estimation, of memory, and of constant physical inventory checks. But with records, the temple administrators could track quantities with far greater precision. They could project future needs, anticipate shortages, and plan for distribution more effectively. This was a crucial step towards organized economic planning, moving beyond mere reaction to proactive management. It is like having a digital inventory system, but instead of scanning barcodes, you have a scribe painstakingly etching symbols into clay. A little slower, perhaps, but just as effective in its day, a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some of these early administrative texts even contain what appear to be primitive forms of purchase orders or delivery manifests. They would list items that were expected to arrive, or items that were being dispatched to a specific location or individual. This shows a remarkable foresight in logistics and supply chain management. It was not just about recording what had happened, but also about documenting what was going to happen. This predictive element was a significant leap forward, allowing for better coordination and resource allocation across the sprawling temple economy. You can almost hear an ancient Sumerian equivalent of "did you check the manifest?" echoing through the storehouse. Historians still argue whether the standardized formatting of these administrative tablets evolved spontaneously from practical necessity or was a deliberate imposition by the temple authorities to ensure consistency and ease of interpretation. Was it a grassroots development or a bureaucratic mandate from the top? Regardless, the consistency in how information was presented on these tablets speaks to a growing understanding of the importance of clear, organized data. They understood that information, to be useful, needed to be structured and easily retrievable. They were creating databases, just not on silicon chips. You might be thinking, but how did they store all these tablets? That is a great question. The answer is surprisingly simple, yet effective: archives. Mainstream historical fact: massive archives of clay tablets have been unearthed in Sumerian cities, organized by topic, by date, or by the department that generated them. These were not random piles of mud. They were organized repositories of information, the libraries and filing cabinets of the ancient world. When a dispute arose, or when administrators needed to consult past records, they could retrieve the relevant tablets from these archives. It was a manual search engine, but a functioning one nonetheless. And unlike your digital files, they were largely impervious to hard drive crashes, though perhaps not entirely immune to accidental smashing by a clumsy Sumerian archivist. Imagine the sheer volume of information being generated. Every transaction, every allocation, every receipt, every delivery, each one a new clay tablet. The logistical challenge of managing these archives alone was immense. It required a system of cataloging, of labeling, of knowing where to find what. And this, in turn, further fueled the development of writing, as scribes needed to record not just the transactions themselves, but also information about the tablets, what they contained, when they were created, and where they belonged in the archive. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of documentation, driven by the ever-increasing complexity of the Sumerian economy. The more records they kept, the more records they needed to keep track of the records. It is a bit like your email inbox, is it not? The concept of accountability truly solidifies with these records. When a scribe recorded a transaction, they were not just documenting an event. They were creating a record of responsibility. If a certain amount of grain was allocated to a particular worker, and that grain was not accounted for, the tablet would show it. This fostered a sense of responsibility among individuals and departments within the temple bureaucracy. It made it much harder for someone to simply say, "I never received that," or "I already paid." The receipt, in its essence, was a tool for transparency and for holding individuals accountable for their actions and their share of the collective resources. It was the original paper trail, only made of mud. You can sense the subtle power shift this system enables. Before widespread record keeping, power was largely in the hands of those who could remember the most, or those who could exert the most physical force. Now, power begins to shift towards those who control information, those who can read and write, those who can manage the vast network of records. The scribes, once perhaps seen as mere clerks, become increasingly indispensable, their knowledge and skills vital to the functioning of the entire society. They were the original gatekeepers of data, and their mastery of cuneiform was their superpower. It is a reminder that in any society, the control of information is a powerful lever, and the Sumerians were among the first to truly grasp this. And they did it with a simple reed and some mud. You are now shifting your focus from the grand scale of the temple to the more intimate interactions of daily life, where these early receipts also played a critical, if less monumental, role. Imagine yourself in a small, bustling workshop where pottery is being made. The air is earthy, scented with damp clay, and the rhythmic whir of the potter's wheel fills the space. A customer comes in, a local farmer, seeking a new storage jar for his olive oil. The transaction is small, but no less important for that. A mainstream historical fact, private commerce and individual transactions existed alongside the temple economy, and these also often relied on some form of record keeping. The Sumerian economy was a hybrid, a blend of centralized control and individual enterprise. In this smaller context, the receipt might not have been a formal clay tablet inscribed by a professional scribe. It could have been something simpler, a small clay token, perhaps marked with a specific symbol representing the jar, or even a simple notch on a piece of wood, a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some scholars suggest that the earliest forms of accounting involved small clay tokens, often shaped like the objects they represented. A cone for a measure of grain, a sphere for a jar of oil. These tokens could then be enclosed in a clay envelope, and the outside of the envelope impressed with the shape of the tokens inside, creating a verifiable record without even needing complex writing. It was a tactile, three-dimensional receipt, a wonderfully elegant solution to a basic problem. Historians still argue whether these token systems evolved directly into cuneiform writing, or whether they were a parallel system that eventually merged with, or was supplanted by, the more abstract cuneiform signs. Was it a direct evolutionary path, or were there separate, independent developments that eventually converged? Regardless, the underlying principle was the same: the need for a verifiable, tangible record of a transaction. The Sumerians were trying every possible method to ensure that a deal, once made, could be remembered and proven. You can appreciate the sheer human ingenuity at play here. Faced with the practical problem of tracking agreements in a world without paper or digital databases, they innovated with the materials at hand. Clay was abundant, pliable when wet, and permanent when dry. It was the perfect medium for their burgeoning record-keeping needs. And the evolution from simple tokens to complex cuneiform shows a remarkable trajectory of intellectual development, driven by the persistent demands of commerce and administration. It is a testament to the idea that necessity truly is the mother of invention, even if that invention is just a piece of mud with some scratches on it. Consider the implications for individual trust. In a small community, reputation and memory might suffice for many transactions. But as communities grew, and as people began to interact with strangers or those from different parts of the city, the need for a more objective form of proof became paramount. The receipt, in any form, provided that objective proof. It was a way to mitigate risk, to reduce the chances of misunderstandings or outright fraud. It provided a common ground, a shared truth, upon which commercial relationships could be built and sustained. It was the original trust but verify system, only a little more literal in its verification methods. Imagine a situation where you lend a neighbor some tools. Without a record, it is easy to forget who owes what. With a simple clay tablet or marked token, the terms of the loan are clear. This extends beyond commercial transactions to personal agreements. The Sumerians were not just tracking beer and barley. They were tracking debts, loans, agreements of all kinds. The receipt, therefore, became a tool for personal accountability and for maintaining social harmony within the community. It prevented petty squabbles from escalating into major conflicts. It was like having a tiny, personal legal system in your pocket. If your pocket was strong enough to hold a piece of baked clay. The development of numerical systems, as mentioned before, was crucial to this. Being able to precisely quantify quantities, not just approximate them, allowed for much more accurate accounting. This level of precision facilitated fair trade and reduced disputes. It was the difference between saying some grain and saying 27 measures of grain. The latter is much harder to dispute, especially when it is etched into a clay tablet. This mathematical sophistication, born out of economic necessity, is a mainstream historical fact that highlights the interconnectedness of different aspects of Sumerian innovation. They were not just inventing writing, they were inventing mathematics and accounting at the same time. And what about the sheer longevity of these records? Because they were made of clay, many of them have survived for thousands of years, providing us with an invaluable window into Sumerian daily life, economy, and administration. It is a quirky or fringe tidbit that the very permanence of their chosen medium, a practical choice for their time, has become a treasure trove for modern archaeologists and historians. If they had written on papyrus, like the Egyptians, much more would have perished over time. The accidental durability of their receipts has given us an incredible amount of information. Perhaps we should all start printing our receipts on clay for future generations to marvel at our questionable shopping habits. So, while the Grand Temple receipts tell us about the macroeconomics of Sumer, these smaller, personal records illuminate the micro-level interactions, the daily ebb and flow of life and commerce. They show us that the need for a verifiable record of a transaction was not just a bureaucratic necessity, but a fundamental human need for clarity, for trust, and for fairness. Whether you were trading a vast quantity of grain or a single storage jar, it speaks to a deep human desire for order and accountability, a desire that transcends millennia and still resonates with us today. It is a reminder that even the simplest piece of documentation can have profound implications for how a society functions. You are now transported to a more specialized corner of Sumerian society, the scribal schools. Imagine a quiet courtyard, shielded from the bustling city, where young boys, and sometimes a few girls, sit on mats, diligently copying signs onto clay tablets. The air is still, punctuated only by the scratching of styluses and the low murmur of instructors. This is where the knowledge of writing, and by extension, the ability to create and interpret receipts, is passed down. A mainstream historical fact. Scribal schools were highly organized and rigorous, playing a crucial role in maintaining the literate bureaucracy of Sumer. Becoming a scribe was a long and arduous process, requiring years of dedicated study. This rigorous training highlights a quirky or fringe tidbit. The Sumerian scribes were not just learning to write. They were learning an entire worldview. Their curriculum included not only cuneiform signs and grammatical rules, but also mathematics, astronomy, legal precedents, and even literary texts. They were the scholars, the intellectuals, and the administrators of their time. They were the original full-stack developers of the ancient world, able to handle everything from data entry to complex legal drafting. It was a demanding profession, but one that offered immense prestige and influence. Historians still argue whether the scribal profession was primarily a hereditary one, passed down from father to son, or if it was more meritocratic, open to anyone with the aptitude and perseverance to master the complex system. Was it a closed guild or a pathway for social mobility? Regardless, the existence of these dedicated schools demonstrates the critical importance the Sumerians placed on literacy and record keeping for the smooth functioning of their society. They understood that the continued efficacy of their economic and administrative systems depended on a steady supply of trained professionals. Think about the sheer cognitive load involved in learning cuneiform. It was not an alphabet. It started as a system of pictographs, then evolved into logograms, signs representing words, and then syllabograms, signs representing syllables. Mastering thousands of these signs, and their various meanings and phonetic values, was an immense intellectual undertaking. It was like learning a combination of Chinese characters, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and a completely new phonetic alphabet all at once, while also having to sculpt your writing surface from mud. It truly makes learning a modern language seem like a walk in the park. The primary purpose of this education, at least initially, was practical to produce scribes who could manage the temple and palace economies. They were trained to draft contracts, record transactions, manage inventories, and administer justice. In essence, they were trained to be the human backbone of the Sumerian receipt system, the living memory and processing power of the ancient world. Without these trained individuals, the entire elaborate structure of Sumerian administration would have crumbled. They were the human infrastructure, the original cloud of computational power. You might be thinking about the daily life of a student in one of these schools. Imagine sitting on the floor, laboriously copying signs onto a practice tablet. Mistakes were common, and tablets would be erased and reused, or simply discarded if the error was too significant. The sound of wet clay being smoothed, the occasional frustrated sigh, the constant presence of the watchful instructor. These were the sights and sounds of ancient learning. It was a hands-on education, literally, where the tools of learning were the very materials of their future profession, and probably a few disciplinary smacks from a reed if you messed up too often. The concept of standardization also emerged from these scribal schools. To ensure that records could be understood across different departments and different cities, there was a need for consistency in how signs were written and how information was structured. The schools played a key role in teaching these standardized conventions, ensuring interoperability in their ancient information network. This was crucial for the scalability of their administrative systems. Imagine if every department in your company used a different font and a different language for their internal memos. Chaos, right? The Sumerians recognized this very early on. This focus on standardized education also had a profound impact on the evolution of writing itself. As scribes sought efficiency and clarity, the complex pictographs gradually simplified and became more abstract, eventually leading to the streamlined wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform. This mainstream historical fact shows how practical needs drove the development of one of the world's first writing systems. It was a continuous process of refinement, driven by the desire to make the process of record-keeping faster, easier, and more universally understandable. It was the original user interface design, driven by the need for more efficient data entry. And what about the social implications of this knowledge? Literacy was not widespread in Sumer. Only a small elite, primarily scribes and priests, possessed the ability to read and write. This created a significant power differential. Those who could read and write held the keys to information and administration, giving them considerable influence and authority. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that the ability to process what we now call receipts was a mark of high social standing and a pathway to power in ancient Sumer. Forget a fancy car. The ultimate status symbol was a well-inked stylus and a perfectly inscribed clay tablet. It was the intellectual equivalent of a gold-plated smartphone. So, while the receipts themselves were utilitarian objects, their creation and management were deeply intertwined with the educational system and the intellectual development of Sumerian society. The scribal schools were not just places of learning. They were the engines of bureaucratic stability and economic growth, ensuring that the critical function of record-keeping, at the heart of their advanced civilization, could continue to flourish. They were literally writing the future, one careful stroke at a time. You are now stepping into the realm of ancient Sumerian law, a fascinating domain where the concept of the receipt takes on a new, formalized significance. Imagine yourself in a dusty courtyard, perhaps before a city elder or a local judge, where a dispute is being heard. The air is tense, the voices of the disputants sharp with accusation and defense. In this setting, the humble clay tablet, the ancient receipt, transforms from a mere economic record into a crucial piece of legal evidence. A mainstream historical fact, the Sumerians developed some of the earliest known law codes, predating even the famous Code of Hammurabi by centuries. These codes often dealt with issues of property, debt, and contract, all areas where a written record was invaluable. Consider a case of disputed debt. A farmer claims he repaid a loan of barley to a merchant, but the merchant denies it. Without a written record, this would be a difficult case to adjudicate. It would come down to the credibility of witnesses, or perhaps a divine oracle. But with a receipt, a small clay tablet detailing the repayment, the matter becomes much clearer. The tablet serves as irrefutable proof, a silent, unbiased witness to the transaction. This is a quirky or fringe tidbit. These early legal receipts were often impressed with cylinder seals, small, carved stone cylinders rolled over the wet clay, leaving a unique impression. These seals acted like signatures, further authenticating the document and making it difficult to forge. Each seal was a unique identifier, the ancient Sumerian equivalent of a biometric signature, a very sophisticated form of anti-fraud protection for their time. Historians still argue whether the development of these legal receipts was driven primarily by the need to resolve disputes between private citizens, or by the temple's desire to formalize its own economic interactions and ensure compliance. Was it a bottom-up demand for fairness, or a top-down mandate for administrative control? Regardless, the shift from purely economic record keeping to legally binding documentation represents a significant evolution in the function and importance of the receipt. It moved from a simple tracking device to a tool for justice. You can almost hear the ancient Sumerian judge, confronted with a contested claim, saying, "Where is the tablet? Show me the seal!" The presence or absence of this tangible proof would often be the deciding factor in a case. This brought a new level of fairness and predictability to the legal system, moving away from arbitrary judgments towards decisions based on concrete evidence. It was a revolutionary concept in a world where personal testimony and social standing often held sway. It transformed legal proceedings from a shouting match into something more akin to our modern evidence-based system. The concept of contract also evolved significantly with the advent of these written records. Before receipts, a contract was essentially a verbal agreement, sometimes sealed with a handshake or a ritual. While such agreements had social weight, they were notoriously difficult to enforce if one party reneged. With a clay tablet, the terms of an agreement, whether it was a sale of land, a loan of silver, or a partnership in a business venture, could be meticulously recorded. This mainstream historical fact of written contracts provided a solid foundation for commercial dealings and allowed for larger, more complex transactions to take place with greater security. It reduced risk and fostered a more robust economy. It was like going from handshake deals to legally binding documents, with a whole lot less guesswork involved. Imagine the peace of mind this brought to individuals. If you were entering into a major transaction, knowing that the terms were clearly written down and authenticated by a seal, you could proceed with greater confidence. It protected both parties, providing a clear record of their mutual obligations. This fostered economic growth by encouraging people to engage in more elaborate and long-term commercial relationships. It was a quiet revolution in trust and security. You could sleep soundly, knowing your receipt was safely tucked away, even if tucked away meant buried in a clay jar in your backyard. The legal implications extended beyond simple debt and property disputes. Marriage contracts, adoption agreements, and even slave sales were recorded on clay tablets. This shows the pervasive reach of written documentation into nearly every aspect of Sumerian life. It was a society that increasingly relied on the written word, not just for economic management, but for the very fabric of its social and legal order. It was a society that understood the power of the pen, or rather, the stylus, in shaping their lives and resolving their conflicts. And the permanence of these records meant that legal precedents could be established and followed over time. If a similar dispute arose in the future, judges could consult past judgments, recorded on tablets, for guidance. This contributed to the development of a more consistent and equitable legal system. It was the beginning of case law, a system where past decisions influence future ones, bringing greater stability and predictability to the application of justice. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that the very act of preserving receipts contributed to the evolution of legal jurisprudence, a truly unexpected side effect of simple record keeping. Their receipts were essentially their law books, all rolled into one. So, while the initial impulse for the receipt may have been purely economic, its evolution into a legal instrument was a profound step forward for Sumerian society. It transformed simple transactions into formalized agreements, provided a basis for resolving disputes, and laid the groundwork for a more ordered and just legal system. The receipt, in this context, was not just about money. It was about justice, order, and the very structure of society. It was the quiet enforcer of ancient rules, etched into clay, a silent testament to the power of documentation. You are now contemplating the practical challenges of a society heavily reliant on clay tablets for all its record-keeping needs. Imagine a massive archive, not unlike a modern library, but instead of books, it is filled with thousands upon thousands of heavy, often oddly shaped, clay tablets. The sheer logistics of storing, organizing, and retrieving these records would have been immense. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Sumerians developed sophisticated methods for archiving their tablets, including shelving systems, labeled baskets, and even rudimentary cataloging systems. It was a bureaucratic marvel, considering the technology available. Consider the weight. A single clay tablet, even a small one, could be substantial. Imagine needing to consult dozens or even hundreds of these tablets for a complex accounting reconciliation or a legal case. The physical labor involved in moving, sorting, and reading them would have been significant. This was not a world of easily searchable digital databases. This was a world of brute force information retrieval, relying on human strength and meticulous organization. It is like trying to do your taxes by sifting through a mountain of brick-sized receipts. Talk about a workout. A quirky or fringe tidbits on tablets were encased in envelopes of clay, often with a summary of the contents or the names of the parties involved inscribed on the outside. This protected the inner tablet from tampering and also provided a quick reference without having to break open the entire envelope. These envelopes were often sealed with cylinder seals, further enhancing their security. It was like having a secure, tamper-proof, and somewhat heavy packaging system for your important documents, and a surprisingly elegant solution for data integrity in a pre-digital age. Historians still argue whether the invention of these clay envelopes was primarily for security purposes, to prevent unauthorized alteration, or for organizational efficiency, to allow for quick identification of the tablet's contents without having to read the entire document. Was it about trust or convenience? Perhaps it was a clever combination of both, a pragmatic solution to multiple problems faced by the ancient Sumerian archivists and administrators. The need to protect valuable information and the need to access it easily often go hand in hand. You can imagine the importance of legible handwriting, or rather, legible cuneiform. A poorly inscribed tablet with smudged or unclear signs would be useless for its intended purpose. Scribes were trained to write clearly and consistently, ensuring that records could be read and understood by anyone familiar with the script. This attention to detail was paramount, as the accuracy of their records directly impacted the functioning of the entire economic and legal system. It is a good reminder that even in ancient times, good penmanship mattered, especially if you were trying to document a lifetime's worth of beer transactions. The development of numerical notation also became increasingly sophisticated within these archives. Mainstream historical fact, the Sumerian sexagesimal system allowed for complex calculations and the tracking of large quantities. Tablets would often contain not just individual transaction records, but also summaries and totals, allowing for overall financial reconciliation. This demonstrates a clear understanding of basic accounting principles, of the need to balance the books, long before the invention of double-entry bookkeeping. They might not have had T accounts, but they certainly had the concept of sums and balances. Consider the role of the archivist. This was a highly specialized and trusted position. The archivist was not just a librarian, they were a custodian of crucial information, a gatekeeper of knowledge. They had to be meticulous, organized, and reliable. Their work was essential for the continuity of the temple and palace administrations, ensuring that historical records were preserved and accessible for future reference. It was a job that required extreme patience and an affinity for dusty, heavy objects, and probably a strong back. The very act of preserving these records speaks to a society that valued history and accountability. They understood that past transactions and agreements had implications for the present and the future. The archives were not just storage facilities. They were the collective memory of the city, a repository of its economic life, its legal precedents, and its administrative decisions. It was a tangible manifestation of their understanding that progress depended on learning from and building upon the past. It turns out, ancient Sumerians were big believers in the power of a good audit trail. And what about the accidental discoveries? It is a quirky or fringe tidbit that many of the most important Sumerian tablets, including thousands of receipts and administrative records, have been discovered in the ruins of ancient cities, often in what appear to have been dedicated archive rooms. These accidental time capsules have provided invaluable insights into their daily lives, their economy, and their intellectual achievements. It is almost as if they left breadcrumbs for future archaeologists, tiny clay clues to their lost civilization. And a good thing too. Otherwise we would have to guess how many sheep they traded for a bushel of dates. So, while the invention of the receipt itself was a breakthrough, the systems developed to manage these receipts, the archives, the envelopes, the standardized writing, the specialized scribes, were equally important. They transformed a simple concept into a functioning, large-scale administrative system, proving that even in ancient times, the effective management of information was key to the success and longevity of a complex society. They built a data center out of dirt, and it lasted for thousands of years. Take that, server farms. You are now invited to consider the broader economic impact of the Sumerian invention of the receipt, extending beyond individual transactions to the very structure of their burgeoning marketplace. Imagine the ancient equivalent of a stock exchange, or at least a large trading hub, where merchants from different cities and regions converge. The air is thick with the buzz of commerce, the excited chatter of traders, and the rhythmic clatter of goods being moved. Here, the receipt in its various forms facilitates not just local trade but intercity and even international commerce. A mainstream historical fact: Sumerian cities engaged in extensive trade networks, exchanging their surplus agricultural goods and manufactured products for raw materials not available locally, such as timber, metals, and precious stones. Without a reliable system of record keeping, such long-distance trade would have been fraught with immense risk. How do you ensure that goods dispatched from Uruk arrive safely in Lagash, and that the agreed-upon payment is rendered? How do you track credit and debt between merchants who might be hundreds of miles apart? The receipt, whether a clay tablet, a sealed bulla, or a marked token, provided that crucial element of trust and accountability across vast distances. It allowed for transactions to extend beyond the immediate sight and memory of the involved parties. It was the original bill of lading, enabling global commerce on an ancient scale. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this long-distance trade: some archaeologists have found evidence of merchant houses or trading companies that operated across different cities, maintaining their own records of transactions and financial dealings. These were proto-corporations using sophisticated accounting methods to manage their extensive networks. Imagine a Sumerian merchant checking their ledger, tallying up debits and credits from trades with distant lands, all recorded on heavy clay tablets. It sounds like something out of a historical novel, but it was their reality. Historians still argue whether the development of these complex trading networks was a primary driver for the sophistication of Sumerian accounting systems, or if the accounting systems evolved independently and then facilitated the expansion of trade. Was it necessity driving invention or invention enabling opportunity? Perhaps it was a symbiotic relationship, each spurring the other to greater complexity. What is clear is that the ability to accurately record and track goods and payments was absolutely essential for the growth of their expansive commercial empire. You can appreciate the reduction of risk this brought to the ancient merchant. Before verifiable receipts, every long-distance transaction was a gamble. You had to trust the word of intermediaries, messengers, and distant partners. Disputes were common, and recourse was difficult. With a written record, however, the terms of the agreement were clear, and the proof of delivery or payment could be presented. This dramatically lowered the risk profile of trade, encouraging more merchants to engage in it, and thus stimulating economic growth and the flow of goods and ideas. It was like getting insurance for your ancient cargo, only the insurance policy was a heavy piece of clay. The concept of credit also became more formalized and widespread with the advent of written records. Mainstream historical fact: Sumerian texts include numerous examples of loans, with specified interest rates and repayment schedules. These loans were often recorded on tablets, serving as legal contracts between the lender and the borrower. This allowed for the accumulation of capital and its deployment for various economic activities, from funding large agricultural projects to financing merchant expeditions. Without reliable records, credit would have been far more limited, hindering economic development. They were essentially operating a sophisticated banking system, one clay tablet at a time. Imagine a Sumerian entrepreneur needing a loan to finance a new venture, perhaps to buy a large herd of sheep or invest in a pottery workshop. With the assurance of a recorded loan agreement, lenders were more willing to provide capital, knowing that their investment was legally protected. This fostered economic dynamism and allowed for larger-scale enterprises than would have been possible in a purely cash-and-carry economy. It was the original venture capital, only instead of pitching to a room full of investors, you were probably pitching to a temple priest with a stylus. The standardization of weights and measures, another mainstream historical fact, also went hand in hand with the development of precise accounting. If you are trading barley with a distant city, both parties need to agree on what constitutes a measure of barley. The Sumerians developed standardized units, often associated with the temple, which helped ensure fairness and consistency in trade. These units would then be meticulously recorded on the receipts, eliminating ambiguity and reducing the potential for fraud. It was their version of quality control and universal metric systems, ensuring everyone was on the same page, or rather, the same tablet. And what about the sheer volume of these trade records? It is a quirky or fringe tidbit that archaeologists have uncovered entire herds of trade documents, including receipts, loan agreements, and shipping manifests from ancient Sumerian cities. These discoveries provide a detailed picture of the scale and complexity of their commercial activities, revealing a sophisticated network of merchants, goods, and financial dealings. It is like finding the ancient equivalent of a massive corporate archive, detailing every single transaction of a global trading empire. It is a treasure trove for anyone interested in the history of economics. So, the receipt, far from being a mere administrative formality, was a critical enabler of the Sumerian economy. It reduced risk, facilitated credit, fostered long-distance trade, and provided the bedrock of trust upon which a complex commercial society could flourish. It allowed the Sumerians to move beyond subsistence farming to a vibrant, interconnected economy, laying the groundwork for the modern world of commerce and finance. It truly was the silent engine of ancient prosperity, meticulously documented on pieces of humble clay. You are now delving into the cultural and intellectual ramifications of the Sumerian receipt, looking beyond its purely economic and legal functions. Imagine the intellectual ferment in ancient Uruk, a city brimming with new ideas, new challenges, and new solutions. The very act of creating and managing receipts, of meticulously recording information, fostered a mindset of precision, organization, and abstract thought. This is a mainstream historical fact. The development of writing, spurred by administrative needs, fundamentally changed how humans thought and communicated, moving towards more abstract and systematic forms of knowledge. Consider the mental leap required to go from concrete pictographs, where a drawing of a head means head, to abstract cuneiform signs that represent syllables, or even sounds. This abstraction was driven by the need for efficiency in record keeping. It was simply too time-consuming to draw a picture for every single item or concept. The scribes, in their tireless quest for speed and clarity in their accounting, inadvertently became pioneers of abstract thought. This is a quirky or fringe tidbit. The very act of abbreviating and simplifying signs for faster receipt creation contributed to the development of a more phonetic script, a stepping stone to alphabetic writing. They were trying to be lazy, and in doing so, they invented the future of writing. Historians still argue whether this intellectual development was a conscious goal of the scribal class, or an emergent property of their daily work, a spontaneous evolution driven by the cumulative effect of thousands of individual scribes trying to make their jobs easier. Was it deliberate innovation or a fortunate accident of efficiency? Regardless, the impact was profound, paving the way for more complex forms of written communication beyond mere lists and ledgers. You can appreciate the development of a literate culture, even if literacy was limited to a small elite. The existence of written records meant that knowledge could be accumulated, preserved, and transmitted across generations with unprecedented accuracy. Before writing, knowledge was largely oral, vulnerable to memory decay, distortion, and loss. With writing, it became tangible, permanent, and accessible over time. The receipts, though mundane in content, were part of this larger revolution in knowledge management. They were the original datasets, forming the basis for later analysis and understanding. Imagine the impact on memory itself. As society became more reliant on written records, the burden on individual memory diminished. You no longer had to remember every single debt, every transaction, every legal precedent. The clay tablet remembered it for you. This freed up cognitive resources for other forms of intellectual activity, perhaps fostering new ways of thinking and problem solving. This is a mainstream historical fact. The shift from oral to literate cultures profoundly impacts human cognition and social organization. It is like offloading your brain's RAM to an external hard drive, allowing you to run more complex mental programs. The very act of imposing order on chaotic reality through systematic record keeping also fostered a scientific mindset. To effectively manage a large economy, you need to quantify, categorize, and analyze data. The Sumerians were doing this on a daily basis with their receipts and administrative texts. This practical need for organization and analysis laid the groundwork for early scientific inquiry, encouraging observation, measurement, and logical deduction. It was not science in the modern sense, but it was the very beginning of a systematic approach to understanding and managing the world. And what about the development of mathematics? The need to count, to measure, to calculate sums and differences was inherent in their accounting practices. Mainstream historical fact: the Sumerians developed sophisticated mathematical systems, including a base 60 system and complex multiplication tables, all driven by the practical demands of their economy and administration. These mathematical tools were essential for creating accurate receipts and managing their complex financial affairs. Their accounting practices were literally driving mathematical innovation. It is like saying your grocery bill is inspiring you to invent calculus. Consider the role of the scribe in this intellectual transformation. They were not just copyists. They were the interpreters and manipulators of this new information system. They were the ones who could abstract numerical data, synthesize different records, and present a coherent picture of the economic state of the city. They were the original data analysts, extracting insights from their clay ledgers. This intellectual work contributed to the development of higher-level cognitive skills, fostering logical reasoning and problem-solving abilities. The permanence of these records also allowed for historical consciousness. For the first time, a society could look back on its past actions, its past decisions, its past economic cycles with concrete evidence. This ability to reflect on a documented past undoubtedly influenced their understanding of time, causality, and their own place in history. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that the humble received, by virtue of its permanence, contributed to the development of a historical narrative, allowing future generations to learn from the economic successes and failures of their ancestors. It was the original big data for historical analysis, just a lot harder to process. So, the Sumerian invention of the receipt, born out of the practical demands of managing a complex economy, had far-reaching intellectual and cultural consequences. It spurred the development of writing, fostered abstract thought, facilitated the accumulation of knowledge, and laid the groundwork for early scientific and mathematical inquiry. It was not just about tracking transactions. It was about transforming the human mind and shaping the very trajectory of intellectual development, proving that even the most mundane innovations can have the most profound and unexpected effects. It was a revolution written in mud, literally. You are now considering the intricate relationship between the Sumerian receipt and the development of early urban planning and infrastructure projects. Imagine soaring over the ancient city of Uruk, seeing its sprawling layout, its massive walls, its intricate network of canals, and its monumental ziggurat. The construction and maintenance of such vast undertakings required immense resources, coordinated labor, and precise management. This is where the receipt, in its role as a tool for resource allocation and labor tracking, became absolutely indispensable. A mainstream historical fact: the Sumerians were master builders and engineers, undertaking large-scale public works projects that required meticulous planning and record-keeping. Think about the sheer scale of building a ziggurat. It involved thousands of laborers, countless tons of mud bricks, and a complex logistical chain for acquiring and distributing materials. How did the temple authorities ensure that every worker received their daily ration of barley? How did they track the inflow of raw materials and the outflow of finished bricks? The receipt in its various forms was the answer. It allowed for detailed tracking of labor input, material consumption, and overall project progress. It was the ancient world's project management software, only a lot less glitchy, probably. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this: some archaeological discoveries have unearthed what appear to be labor registers, or work rosters, inscribed on clay tablets. These documents would list the names of workers, the number of days they worked, and the amount of rations they were due. These were essentially ancient time cards, crucial for payroll and for ensuring fair compensation for the massive workforce employed on public works projects. Imagine the Sumerian equivalent of a HR department, diligently tracking every single employee's hours on a series of clay tablets. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these urban projects drove the sophistication of their record-keeping systems, or if the already developing accounting methods simply enabled these ambitious endeavors to take place. Was it a pull from engineering needs, or a push from administrative capabilities? Regardless, the interconnectedness is undeniable. The Sumerians could not have built their cities and maintained their vast irrigation networks without a robust system for tracking resources and labor, and that system was fundamentally built on the concept of the receipt. You can appreciate the sheer organizational genius involved. Imagine trying to manage a construction project the size of the Great Pyramid of Giza, but without any blueprints, without any written contracts, and without any way to track who did what and who was paid. It would be a chaotic free-for-all. The Sumerians, through their meticulous record-keeping, were able to bring order to this chaos, ensuring that large-scale projects could be planned, executed, and successfully completed. They were the original master planners, using their receipts as their primary tools for execution. The concept of budgeting also emerged in this context. Mainstream historical fact. Some Sumerian administrative texts appear to be early forms of budgets, allocating specific amounts of resources or labor to different projects or departments. This shows a forward-thinking approach to resource management, planning for expenditures before they occurred, based on anticipated needs and available resources. These budgets were ultimately built on the data provided by countless receipts from past projects, allowing them to estimate future needs with greater accuracy. It was their version of financial forecasting, long before spreadsheets existed. Imagine the foresight involved in planning a new irrigation canal that would stretch for miles, diverting water from the river to new agricultural lands. This required calculating the necessary labor, the amount of tools, the food rations for the workers, and the time frame for completion. All these calculations relied on the accumulated data from past projects, data meticulously recorded on receipts and administrative tablets. The receipts were the raw ingredients for their grand engineering feats. The role of the scribe, in this context, was elevated even further. They were not just record keepers. They were integral members of the planning and execution teams for these major projects. They would interpret the data from past receipts to help inform future decisions, essentially acting as project managers and financial advisors. This mainstream historical fact highlights their crucial role in the successful completion of these monumental endeavors. They were the unsung heroes of ancient urban development, ensuring everything stayed on track and within budget, at least in theory. And what about the sheer durability of these records? It is a quirky or fringe tidbit that the very mud bricks used in Sumerian construction were sometimes inscribed with dedicatory texts or ownership marks, effectively turning the buildings themselves into monumental receipts of their creation and purpose. While not receipts in the transactional sense, they underscore the Sumerian propensity for imbuing physical objects with documented information, a profound and lasting legacy. It is like having a permanent inscription on every building stating who built it and why. So, the Sumerian invention of the receipt was not just an economic tool. It was a fundamental enabler of their remarkable achievements in urban planning and infrastructure development. It allowed them to manage complex projects, allocate resources efficiently, and coordinate the efforts of vast numbers of people, laying the physical and organizational groundwork for one of the world's first great civilizations. It was the silent force behind their monumental achievements, meticulously documented on humble pieces of clay. Their receipts literally built cities. You are now examining the ripple effect of the Sumerian receipt on the concept of time and history. Imagine yourself in a quiet corner of a temple archive, surrounded by stacks of clay tablets, each representing a moment captured from the past. The meticulous dating of these receipts, often by year and specific event, allowed for a much more precise understanding of chronology and the flow of historical events. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Sumerians were among the first to develop a systematic approach to dating events, often using regnal years of kings or significant annual events. This chronological record keeping was heavily influenced by their administrative and economic needs, driven by the desire to track transactions over time. Before widespread written records, history was largely an oral tradition, passed down through generations, prone to embellishment and selective memory. With the advent of dated receipts and other administrative documents, a tangible, verifiable timeline began to emerge. You could say, this debt was incurred in the year the Great Canal was dug, or this grain was delivered during the reign of King Shulgi. This level of chronological precision was a quirky or fringe tidbit for its time, laying the groundwork for what we now understand as historical scholarship. Their receipts were the original timestamp, marking moments in time with unwavering accuracy. Historians still argue whether the development of such precise dating systems was a conscious attempt to record history for posterity, or simply a pragmatic necessity for managing long-term economic agreements and administrative cycles. Was it about historical legacy, or about managing the practicalities of a multi-year loan? Regardless, the outcome was the same: a more accurate and verifiable understanding of time and sequence. You can appreciate the power of this historical precision. It allowed for the tracking of long-term economic trends, such as harvest yields over several decades, or the accumulation of wealth by certain families or institutions. This kind of longitudinal data, gleaned from countless receipts, would have been invaluable for long-term planning and for understanding the economic cycles of their civilization. It was the original economic indicator, written in mud, allowing them to predict future famines or surpluses based on past performance. The very act of creating and preserving these dated records instilled a sense of historical consciousness. Mainstream historical fact: many Sumerian kings commissioned inscriptions that glorified their reigns and achievements, often referencing specific construction projects or military victories. These monumental inscriptions often drew upon the administrative records, including the receipts that detailed the labor and resources expended, providing factual grounding for their historical narratives. The receipts were the raw data for their grand historical sagas. Imagine a scribe tasked with compiling a list of a king's achievements. They would consult the archive, pulling out tablets detailing the construction of temples, the digging of canals, the provisioning of armies. Each receipt, though humble, contributed a piece to the larger historical mosaic. The scribes, therefore, became not just record keepers but also the earliest historians, piecing together the past from the fragmented evidence of daily transactions. They were the original data archaeologists, sifting through the layers of clay to reconstruct the past. The concept of legacy also takes on new meaning with these permanent records. Kings and powerful individuals could ensure that their accomplishments and their generosity were documented for future generations. The receipts, by recording their donations to temples or their investments in public works, served as enduring testaments to their contributions. It was a form of ancient PR, ensuring their good deeds were not forgotten, and a subtle form of boasting too, etched in stone. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some Sumerian legal documents, including wills and inheritance records, would carefully detail the history of property ownership, tracing it back through several generations. This reliance on documented lineage and previous transactions underscores the importance of historical receipts for establishing legal claims and maintaining social order across time. Your family history was literally written on clay tablets, each property transfer documented for all eternity, or at least until an archaeologist dug it up. So, the Sumerian receipt, born from the practical need to manage daily transactions, had a profound and unexpected impact on their understanding of time and history. It allowed for the creation of precise chronologies, facilitated the accumulation of historical knowledge, and laid the groundwork for systematic historical inquiry. It transformed the ephemeral present into a documented past, ensuring that the economic and administrative life of Sumer could be remembered, studied, and learned from, truly shaping their sense of self and their place in the grand sweep of time. It was the quiet archivist of ancient moments, making history one clay tablet at a time. You are now examining the fundamental shift in societal structure facilitated by the Sumerian invention of the receipt. Imagine a world transforming from small, relatively egalitarian villages to complex, hierarchical urban centers. This transition, a mainstream historical fact known as the Urban Revolution, was not merely about population growth. It was about the emergence of specialized labor, centralized authority, and stratified social classes. The receipt, in its various forms, was a crucial instrument in managing this increasing complexity and solidifying these new social orders. Before widespread record-keeping, social structures were often maintained through oral tradition, personal relationships, and religious rituals. While these systems could support small communities, they became increasingly inadequate for large, diverse cities. The receipt provided an objective mechanism for managing the distribution of resources, tracking labor contributions, and formalizing social obligations. It allowed for the emergence of a more complex bureaucracy, which in turn supported a more stratified society. A quirky or fringe tidbit: the very existence of a dedicated scribal class, whose power and status were directly tied to their mastery of writing and record-keeping, is a direct consequence of the need for receipts. These scribes formed a new social stratum, distinct from farmers, warriors, or priests, holding immense influence due to their control over information. They were the original information brokers, indispensable to the functioning of the state. Imagine a society where the ultimate status symbol was being able to correctly fill out your tax forms. Historians still argue whether the development of centralized bureaucratic control, facilitated by receipts, was primarily a response to environmental pressures like flood control and irrigation, or if it was driven more by the ambitions of emerging elites to consolidate power and wealth. Was it an adaptive necessity, or a tool for social engineering? Regardless, the capacity to manage large populations and complex economies through written records was a key factor in the rise of centralized authority and the formation of the first states. You can see how the receipt solidified power structures. The temple and the palace, as the primary centers of economic activity and administration, controlled the production and dissemination of these records. They knew who owed what, who had contributed how much labor, and who was entitled to what share of the collective resources. This knowledge was power, allowing them to efficiently manage their territories, levy taxes, and mobilize labor for public works or military campaigns. The receipt, in this sense, was a tool of governance, enabling the state to exert control over its populace. It was the original database of citizens, allowing the rulers to keep tabs on everyone's contributions. The concept of taxation also became more formalized and systematic with the advent of detailed receipts. Mainstream historical fact: Sumerian administrative texts clearly show evidence of a system of taxation, where a portion of agricultural produce or labor was levied by the temple or the palace. The receipts were essential for tracking these levies, ensuring that everyone contributed their fair share and that the state could accurately assess its resources. Without precise records, it would have been impossible to implement such a widespread and consistent system of taxation. It was the original show me your tax returns system, only it involved much less paper and more dirt. Imagine a farmer, at harvest time, bringing a portion of his yield to the temple storehouse. The receipt he receives is not just proof of delivery, it is also proof that he has fulfilled his civic duty, that he has contributed to the collective good. This formalization of civic obligation through the medium of the receipt further integrated individuals into the state apparatus and reinforced their role within the hierarchical society. It was the original receipt for your good citizenship, a tangible reminder of your place in the social order. The ability to track individual contributions and allocations also allowed for a more nuanced system of social differentiation. Those who contributed more, or who held positions of greater responsibility, might be entitled to larger rations or greater privileges. The receipts provided the data to support and legitimize these distinctions. They were not just economic records, they were a reflection and reinforcement of the social hierarchy. It was a quiet way of saying, this person gets more beer because their receipts show they dug more canals. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some scholars suggest that the development of specialized tags or labels attached to various commodities or individuals, often recorded on small clay tablets, allowed for more efficient categorization and identification within the burgeoning bureaucracy. These tags were not receipts themselves, but ancillary records that facilitated the management of vast amounts of information related to their economic system, further solidifying the bureaucratic structures that underpinned their stratified society. It was like their version of a QR code, but with a lot more manual labor involved in the scanning. So, the Sumerian invention of the receipt was more than just an economic convenience. It was a fundamental catalyst for the transformation of Sumerian society. It enabled the rise of centralized authority, supported the growth of complex bureaucracies, formalized taxation, and solidified social hierarchies, providing the administrative backbone for the world's first true urban civilizations. It was the quiet architect of social order, etched into the very fabric of their daily transactions. Their receipts literally shaped their society, You are now envisioning the subtle but significant impact of the Sumerian receipt on the concept of intellectual property and accountability. Imagine a world where ideas, designs, and even specific methods of production could be documented and attributed. While not intellectual property in the modern legal sense, the foundations were being laid. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Sumerians had highly specialized craftspeople, and the recording of their output, often for the temple or palace, inherently created a record of their skilled labor and artistic contributions. Consider a master potter renowned for the quality of his jars, or a weaver celebrated for her intricate patterns. When their products were delivered to the temple storehouse, their output would be recorded, often with their name or a distinctive mark. This might not have been for copyright purposes, but it certainly created a verifiable record of their contribution. This is a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some tablets contain what appear to be inventories of craftspeople and their specialized skills, indicating a nascent understanding of individual expertise and output, implicitly connecting production with individual creators. Historians still argue whether the purpose of recording a craftsman's name alongside his output was primarily for accountability in terms of quality control, or whether it also served as a form of recognition and prestige for skilled labor. Was it about tracking errors or celebrating excellence? Perhaps it was a blend of both, a practical means of oversight that also conferred a degree of status on the producer. You can see how this system fostered a sense of accountability for quality. If a batch of inferior pottery was delivered, the receipt would point directly to the craftsman responsible. This incentivized quality work and professional pride. It was a tangible form of reputation management, with your receipts being your historical record of performance. And in a communal economy, maintaining a good reputation was essential for continued employment and access to resources. It was the original customer review system, only less prone to angry rants in the comments section. The concept of standardization also played a role here, influencing both the production of goods and the recording of them. Mainstream historical fact: Sumerian craftspeople often produced goods to specific sizes, weights, and forms, especially for temple or palace use. The receipts would then reflect these standardized units, simplifying inventory and quality control. This mutual reinforcement between standardized production and standardized recording further streamlined their complex economy. It was their version of industrial quality control, ensuring that every jar of oil was exactly the same size. Imagine a large order for bricks for a new temple. Each batch of bricks delivered would be accompanied by a receipt, detailing the quantity and perhaps the quality. This allowed the project managers to track progress and ensure that the contractors were meeting their obligations. The receipts were not just about payment. They were about performance and compliance. They were the original construction project progress reports. The detailed nature of some of these receipts also allowed for the analysis of production processes and resource consumption. Mainstream historical fact: some administrative texts provide insights into the raw materials used to produce certain goods, allowing scholars to reconstruct ancient manufacturing techniques. While not directly intended for this purpose, the receipts, by virtue of their meticulous detail, inadvertently became a historical record of Sumerian technology and industrial output. They were the unwitting chroniclers of ancient engineering. A quirky or fringe tidbit: there are some scholarly interpretations that suggest certain complex receipts, particularly those related to large-scale projects, might have contained schematic drawings or rudimentary diagrams alongside the written text, further clarifying the nature of the goods or services rendered. While rare, such instances would highlight a sophisticated attempt to convey detailed information beyond mere words and numbers, bridging the gap between documentation and visual representation. It was like having a little blueprint embedded in your delivery note. So, while the Sumerian receipt did not directly create the concept of modern intellectual property, it certainly laid the groundwork for attributing work, ensuring accountability for quality, and tracking the output of skilled labor. It fostered a culture where individual contribution and professional standards were documented and valued, contributing to the development of specialized crafts and the overall economic sophistication of their civilization. It was a silent witness to ancient innovation, meticulously recorded on clay, proving that every creation, every effort, deserved its proper acknowledgement. You are now considering the profound, albeit often invisible, impact of the Sumerian receipt on the development of abstract thought. and the very structure of human language. Imagine a world where the ability to record concrete transactions, like 3 sheep for 5 measures of barley, gradually leads to the capacity to express far more complex, abstract ideas. This is a mainstream historical fact. The development of writing, driven initially by economic needs, fundamentally transformed human cognition and the very way we conceptualize the world. Before the widespread use of written records, much of human thought was tied to immediate experience and oral storytelling. Concepts were often embodied in narratives or concrete examples. The receipt, by forcing the Sumerians to categorize, quantify, and systematize information, pushed them towards a more abstract mode of thinking. To record 5 measures of barley means you must abstract the concept of 5 from 5 actual objects, and the concept of measure from a specific container. This process of abstraction is a quirky or fringe tidbit, a subtle cognitive shift that paved the way for philosophy, science, and higher mathematics. They were literally writing their way into more complex thought. Historians still argue whether the development of cuneiform's phonetic elements was primarily a consequence of administrative efficiency, making it easier to write down names and foreign words, or if it was a more deliberate intellectual breakthrough, reflecting a growing awareness of the sounds that make up language. Was it a pragmatic shortcut or a cognitive leap? Regardless, this move towards phonetic representation further divorced language from its concrete origins, allowing for a more abstract and versatile system of communication. You can appreciate how the very act of creating lists, which receipts fundamentally are, fosters logical organization. Mainstream historical fact: early Sumerian administrative texts often consist of long lists of items, quantities, and names. This systematic tabulation of information encouraged a linear, organized way of thinking, a departure from the more fluid and associative nature of oral tradition. It was the original spreadsheet, forcing a structured approach to data. This structured approach to thought, born from the mundane task of inventory, had profound implications for intellectual development. Imagine the mental exercise involved in creating a complex receipt that details multiple transactions, different types of goods, and various parties. This required mental organization, categorization, and the ability to link disparate pieces of information. It was a cognitive training ground, strengthening the brain's capacity for logical reasoning and systematic analysis. Their daily work as scribes was essentially a rigorous mental workout, building the muscles of abstract thought. The development of a shared, written language, even if initially limited to record keeping, also had a unifying effect. Mainstream historical fact: cuneiform, as it spread across Mesopotamia, provided a common medium of communication and administration, transcending local dialects and fostering a shared intellectual culture. This facilitated economic interaction, legal consistency, and administrative coherence across different city-states. The receipt, by being a universal form of documentation, contributed to this linguistic and cultural cohesion. It was the original universal translator, bridging the gaps between different Sumerian communities. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some scholars suggest that the development of specialized vocabulary for economic and administrative terms, often found in early receipts, contributed to the formalization and precision of the Sumerian language itself. The need to clearly define quantities, types of goods, and legal obligations led to the creation of precise terminology, enriching the linguistic landscape. It was like the early development of technical jargon, but for ancient accountants and merchants. So, the Sumerian receipt, seemingly a simple tool for tracking transactions, was a powerful engine of intellectual and linguistic development. It pushed humanity towards more abstract forms of thought, fostered logical organization, strengthened cognitive abilities, and contributed to the standardization and sophistication of language itself. It was not just a record of what was. It was a catalyst for how they thought and communicated, quietly shaping the very foundations of human intellect and expression. Their receipts were literally writing their minds. You are now considering the role of the Sumerian receipt in managing and mitigating ancient crises, particularly those related to food security and resource scarcity. Imagine a period of drought or a devastating flood threatening the very survival of the city. In such moments, the temple, as the central repository of grain and other vital resources, played a critical role in distributing aid. This is a mainstream historical fact. The temple acted as a social safety net, collecting surplus in good years and distributing it in times of scarcity, a system vital for urban survival. And the receipt was the indispensable tool for this vital function. During a crisis, precise record keeping became even more critical. How do you ensure that emergency rations are distributed fairly, that everyone receives their due share, and that resources are not diverted or misused? The receipts, detailing allocations to families or individuals, provided the necessary transparency and accountability. They ensured that aid reached its intended recipients and allowed administrators to track remaining supplies with accuracy, preventing complete social breakdown. It was the original disaster relief tracking system, preventing chaos in times of immense stress. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some tablets found in temple archives contain records of emergency distributions, or famine rations, detailing how much grain was allocated to various households during times of hardship. These records not only shed light on the severity of past crises, but also demonstrate the sophisticated administrative capacity of the Sumerians to manage and respond to such disasters. Imagine ancient spreadsheets filled with rows of desperate families and columns of barley allocations. A grim but vital record. Historians still argue whether the initial impetus for centralized grain storage and distribution was primarily driven by the need to manage environmental risks, or if it was a happy coincidence that a system designed for economic efficiency also proved invaluable during crisis. Was it proactive preparation or reactive adaptation? Regardless, the ability to collect, store, and redistribute resources effectively, supported by detailed receipts, was a hallmark of successful Sumerian urbanism and a key factor in their resilience. You can appreciate the reduction of social unrest this system provided. In times of scarcity, inequality and perceived unfairness can quickly lead to riots and rebellion. By having a transparent system of distribution, documented by receipts, the temple could maintain social order and ensure that even in the toughest times, the basic needs of the populace were addressed, at least to a manageable degree. It was the original social safety net, preventing widespread famine and the resulting chaos, all verifiable with a small clay token. The concept of public works also ties into this. Mainstream historical fact: in times of surplus, labor that might otherwise be idle could be mobilized for large-scale public works, like irrigation canals or temple construction, strengthening the city's infrastructure and preparing for future challenges. The receipts for labor and materials were essential for managing these efforts, ensuring that resources were effectively utilized and that the community as a whole benefited, ultimately contributing to long-term resilience against environmental fluctuations. Imagine a city after a devastating flood. The fields are ruined, the food supply is disrupted. The temple would draw upon its reserves, meticulously recorded on tablets, to feed the population and to mobilize labor for reconstruction efforts. The receipts would track every bushel of grain distributed, every day of labor contributed to rebuilding. It was a holistic system of disaster management, grounded in meticulous documentation. They were planning for the worst and documenting it every step of the way. The long-term planning capabilities enabled by these records also extended to agricultural management. Mainstream historical fact detailed records of past harvests, rainfall patterns, and resource allocation allowed Sumerian administrators to develop strategies for optimizing agricultural yields and preparing for lean years. These records, essentially aggregate receipts of agricultural output, informed their understanding of the land and its productivity. It was the original agricultural data science, allowing them to manage their primary resource with surprising sophistication. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some scholars have even suggested that the detailed astronomical observations made by Sumerian scribes, often recorded on tablets, were not just for religious or astrological purposes, but also had a practical application in predicting seasonal changes and agricultural cycles, further aiding in their long-term resource management and disaster preparedness. These astronomical observations, meticulously recorded, could be seen as another layer of data informing their receipt-based economic system. It was the original climate data, used to plan for future harvests and avoid past mistakes. So, the Sumerian invention of the receipt was far more than a mere transactional tool. It was a cornerstone of their resilience in the face of environmental challenges and societal crises. It enabled precise resource management, fair distribution of aid, effective mobilization of labor for public works, and long-term planning, all contributing to the stability and survival of their complex urban civilization. It was the silent guardian against chaos, meticulously documented on clay, helping their society weather the storms of nature and time. You are now examining the specialized role of temple administrators and palace officials in the broader system of Sumerian receipts. Imagine yourself inside the vast, bustling administrative wing of a Sumerian temple, a hive of activity where decisions are made, resources are allocated, and records are meticulously kept. The air is thick with the scent of clay and the low murmur of voices, a testament to the immense bureaucratic machinery at work. This is a mainstream historical fact. The temple and palace administrations were the largest employers of scribes and the primary generators and consumers of receipts in Sumerian society. They were the original corporate headquarters, running a complex organization with meticulous detail. These administrators were the ultimate users of the receipt system. For them, the individual receipt was a single data point, a piece of a much larger puzzle. Their job was to aggregate these individual records, synthesize the information, and make high-level decisions about resource allocation, labor management, and economic planning. They needed to know not just how much barley was delivered yesterday, but how much was in storage citywide, how much was needed for the next month's rations, and how much surplus could be exchanged for precious metals from distant lands. It was a massive data analysis challenge, handled entirely manually. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some administrative tablets contain what appear to be summary reports or balance sheets, compiled from numerous individual receipts. These documents would provide a snapshot of the temple's economic status, its assets, and liabilities. This demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of financial reporting, long before the invention of modern accounting principles. Imagine a Sumerian executive looking over his quarterly report, compiled on a collection of heavy clay tablets. They were effectively running a massive, vertically integrated corporation. Historians still argue whether the development of these higher-level administrative reports was a direct mandate from ruling elites seeking greater oversight, or an organic evolution driven by the practical needs of mid-level administrators trying to make sense of the vast amounts of data generated by the receipt system. Was it a top-down requirement or a bottom-up innovation? Regardless, the ability to summarize and analyze information from multiple receipts was critical for effective governance and economic management at a macro level. You can appreciate the intellectual demands placed on these administrators. They needed not only to understand the individual receipts but also to see the larger patterns, to identify trends, and to anticipate future needs. They were the original strategic planners, using their massive collection of receipts as their primary source of intelligence. This required a keen understanding of economics, logistics, and human behavior, all distilled from the seemingly mundane details of daily transactions. The concept of forecasting also emerged from this administrative practice. Mainstream historical fact: by analyzing past harvest yields, consumption rates, and trade volumes, recorded on countless receipts, administrators could make educated predictions about future food supplies and resource availability. This allowed them to plan for future planting, storage, and distribution, minimizing the risk of shortages and maximizing the efficiency of their economy. It was the original predictive analytics, all powered by meticulous historical data. Imagine the discussions among these administrators. They would pore over their summary tablets, debating resource allocations, planning for new construction projects, or strategizing about trade expeditions. The data from the receipts would be their bedrock, providing objective evidence for their decisions. This moved governance from mere intuition or divine decree to a more data-driven approach, a revolutionary concept for its time. They were literally crunching the numbers, albeit with their fingers in wet clay. The meticulousness of the Sumerian administrative system, built on the foundation of the receipt, also fostered a culture of accountability within the bureaucracy itself. Mainstream historical fact: records would often show not just the transaction, but also the names of the officials responsible for recording it, verifying it, and authorizing it. This chain of accountability ensured that errors or malfeasance could be traced back to their source, fostering integrity within the administrative ranks. It was the original audit trail, ensuring that everyone's work was verifiable. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some tablets have even been found that contain what appear to be performance reviews, or disciplinary records, for scribes or other temple officials, documenting their efficiency or any mistakes they made in their record keeping. This suggests a formal system of accountability within the administrative hierarchy, where the accuracy of receipts was not just a preference but a professional expectation, with consequences for failure. It was the original employee performance management system, with written warnings etched in stone. So the Sumerian receipt was not just a tool for individual transactions, but a foundational element of their sophisticated administrative system, enabling temple and palace officials to manage vast resources, plan for the future, and govern their complex society with unprecedented precision and accountability. It was the silent engine of their bureaucratic power, transforming raw data into strategic insights, literally building an empire one meticulously recorded transaction at a time. Their receipts were the very blueprints of their governance. You are now examining the long-term impact of the Sumerian receipt on the development of writing itself, moving beyond its initial practical function to its evolution into a medium for literature, law, and history. Imagine the gradual transformation of simple accounting marks into the complex, expressive script capable of capturing the nuances of human thought and emotion. This is a mainstream historical fact cuneiform, initially developed for economic record-keeping, gradually expanded its scope to encompass religious texts, legal codes, epic poetry, and historical chronicles. The receipt was the humble seed from which all these grand literary and intellectual achievements blossomed. The constant practice of inscribing, reading, and organizing receipts honed the scribe's skills and familiarity with the cuneiform system. This daily engagement with the written word, even in its most mundane form, cultivated a growing mastery of the script, leading to its refinement and expansion. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that the sheer volume of receipts produced inadvertently provided the necessary practice ground for scribes to develop the speed and fluency required for more complex literary endeavors. Think of it as ancient typing practice, only with much heavier keyboards. Historians still argue whether the transition from purely administrative writing to more diverse literary forms was a natural progression driven by the increasing fluency of scribes, or if it was a deliberate choice by religious or political elites to use the new technology for broader purposes of propaganda, education, or cultural preservation. Was it an organic evolution or a top-down mandate? Regardless, the capacity of cuneiform to capture complex ideas was fundamentally enabled by its initial development for practical record-keeping. You can appreciate the gradual development of a shared literary tradition. As scribes became proficient in writing, they began to record not just transactions, but also myths, legends, and wisdom literature. Mainstream historical fact, some of the world's oldest literary works, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, were written in cuneiform. These texts, though vastly different in content from receipts, utilized the same fundamental writing system and shared a common intellectual lineage. The receipt was the unglamorous ancestor of epic poetry, proving that necessity really can be the mother of invention, even for art. Imagine the scribes, after a long day of recording barley transactions, perhaps unwinding by copying a passage from a creation myth or a heroic tale. This transition from the purely utilitarian to the artistic demonstrates the versatility and power of the written word. The tools and techniques developed for accounting were now being applied to storytelling, to the preservation of cultural memory, and to the exploration of human experience. It was the original content creation, expanding from spreadsheets to narratives. The development of legal codes like the Code of Ur-Nammu also directly benefited from the advancements in writing driven by receipt keeping. Mainstream historical fact, these codes, written in cuneiform, provided a standardized framework for justice, ensuring consistency and fairness in legal rulings. The precision required for recording economic transactions translated directly to the precision needed for drafting laws, where every word and nuance mattered. The receipts were the legal precedents that ultimately informed these comprehensive law codes. A quirky or fringe tidbit, some scholarly analyses of early Sumerian proverbs and wisdom texts suggest that their structure and emphasis on logical progression and cause and effect reasoning were subtly influenced by the systematic and sequential nature of administrative record-keeping. The discipline of organizing data in receipts might have unconsciously shaped their approach to moral instruction and philosophical thought. It is like saying that your accounting habits are making you a better philosopher. So, the Sumerian invention of the receipt, humble though it may seem, was a profound catalyst for the broader development of writing. It provided the initial impetus, the practical application, and the continuous practice that allowed cuneiform to evolve from a simple accounting tool into a sophisticated medium for literature, law, and history. It was the quiet enabler of intellectual and cultural flourishing. proving that the roots of great civilizations can often be found in the most mundane, yet meticulously executed daily practices. Their receipts wrote their civilization. You are now examining the legacy of the Sumerian receipt system, considering its lasting impact on subsequent civilizations in Mesopotamia and beyond. Imagine the vast sweep of ancient history, where ideas and innovations rarely stayed confined to their point of origin. The cuneiform script and the administrative practices developed in Sumer were not isolated phenomena. They were adopted, adapted, and disseminated across the Near East for millennia. This is a mainstream historical fact. Cuneiform was used for over 3,000 years by various cultures, including the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Hittites, for administrative, legal, and literary purposes. The fundamental concept of using written records for economic management, contract enforcement, and historical documentation, perfected by the Sumerians through their receipt system, became a cornerstone for all subsequent Mesopotamian empires. The Babylonians, for example, famous for their complex legal code, the Code of Hammurabi, built directly upon the Sumerian tradition of written contracts and legal records, many of which were essentially formalized receipts of agreements. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that many of the legal concepts we recognize today, such as presumption of innocence, specific performance, and even aspects of liability, can be traced back to the detailed, evidence-based legal system pioneered by the Sumerians through their reliance on verifiable records. Historians still argue whether the adoption of cuneiform and Sumerian administrative practices by later empires was primarily due to its inherent efficiency and proven utility, or if it also represented a cultural embrace of Sumerian intellectual prestige and tradition. Was it pure pragmatism or cultural emulation? Regardless, the long-term persistence of the cuneiform receipt system across diverse cultures speaks volumes about its effectiveness and adaptability. You can appreciate how this administrative continuity fostered regional stability and economic integration. With a common system of record-keeping, trade could flourish more easily between different empires, and legal disputes could be resolved with greater consistency. The receipt became a universal language of commerce and administration, facilitating interactions across vast geographical and cultural divides. It was the original interoperable data format, allowing different empires to share economic information. Imagine a Babylonian merchant trading with an Assyrian counterpart. While their spoken languages might have differed, the format and content of their clay tablet receipts would have been instantly recognizable and understandable. This shared administrative infrastructure, built on Sumerian foundations, was a powerful force for commercial cooperation and peaceful exchange, even amidst periods of political rivalry. It was the universal handshake of ancient commerce, recorded in durable clay. The scribal tradition, so central to the Sumerian receipt system, also continued for millennia. Mainstream historical fact scribes in later Mesopotamian empires underwent similar rigorous training to their Sumerian predecessors, ensuring the continued mastery and application of cuneiform for administrative and scholarly purposes. This unbroken lineage of scribal expertise ensured that the knowledge of record-keeping and the culture of precision it fostered was passed down through the ages. A quirky or fringe tidbit, in some later periods, scribes would even produce exercise tablets or model contracts for training purposes, which were essentially blank receipt templates to be filled in by students. These pedagogical tools highlight the enduring importance of practical record-keeping skills in Mesopotamian education, long after the Sumerian language itself ceased to be spoken. It was like their version of fill-in-the-blanks worksheets, but with much more historical significance. So, the Sumerian invention of the receipt, and the intricate system of record-keeping it engendered, cast a long shadow over subsequent civilizations. It provided the administrative bedrock for empires that rose and fell over thousands of years, shaping their economies, legal systems, and intellectual traditions. It was a silent, persistent force, quietly underpinning the prosperity and stability of ancient Mesopotamia, a testament to the enduring power of a simple idea perfected in mud. Their receipts were the blueprint for ancient empire. You are now contemplating the connection between the Sumerian receipt and the very concept of money, a ubiquitous aspect of your modern life that had its nascent beginnings in these ancient practices. Imagine a world gradually transitioning from direct barter to a more standardized system of exchange, where value could be quantified and stored. While the Sumerians did not invent coinage as you know it, their meticulous record-keeping of commodities laid the essential groundwork for abstract units of value. This is a mainstream historical fact. Early Mesopotamian economies often used barley or silver by weight as a standard unit of value, effectively functioning as proto-money. The receipt, by consistently documenting the exchange of goods for standardized quantities of barley or silver, played a crucial role in establishing these commodities as accepted forms of payment. When a receipt stated 5 measures of barley received for 1 sheep, it reinforced barley's role as a medium of exchange and a unit of account. This meticulous record-keeping transformed a physical commodity into an abstract unit of value, a crucial step towards the concept of money. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that the very act of writing down transactions, even for a physical commodity, helped to dematerialize value and make it more abstract, paving the way for eventual coinage. Historians still argue whether the use of barley and silver as standardized values emerged organically from practical trading needs, or if it was deliberately promoted by temple and palace authorities to facilitate administration and taxation. Was it a bottom-up innovation, or a top-down mandate for financial standardization? Regardless, the detailed recording of these transactions on receipts solidified their role as accepted forms of payment and valuation. You can appreciate the efficiency this brought to the ancient marketplace. Before a standardized unit of value, every transaction was a complex negotiation of relative worth. How many fish for a bolt of cloth? How many dates for a pottery jar? With a standardized unit like barley, or later silver by weight, transactions became much simpler and more predictable. The receipt became a statement of quantifiable value, reducing ambiguity and fostering more fluid commerce. It was the original price tag, written in mud, and it made shopping a lot less of a headache. Imagine a Sumerian merchant wanting to acquire timber from a distant land. Instead of having to transport a specific quantity of barley or livestock, which would be cumbersome and risky, they could agree on a value in silver by weight, which was more portable and universally recognized. The receipt would then document this agreed upon value, allowing for complex, multi-stage transactions. This system, built on the reliability of recorded value, facilitated long-distance trade and the accumulation of wealth. It was the original cash transaction, even if the cash was a lump of silver. The concept of debt and interest also became much more formalized with the detailed recording of transactions, which is a mainstream historical fact. Loans were given in quantities of barley or silver, and repayment was expected with interest, all meticulously documented on receipts. This enabled the development of a sophisticated credit system, allowing for investment and economic growth. The receipt was the original loan agreement, outlining the terms and conditions with precision. It paved the way for financial institutions, making borrowing and lending a much more secure and predictable affair. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some very early Sumerian tablets contain what appear to be rudimentary exchange rates between different commodities, indicating a sophisticated understanding of relative values in their proto-monetary system. These lists, essentially early currency conversion tables, would have been invaluable for merchants and administrators, all derived from the consistent recording of trade on receipts. It was like their version of a foreign exchange market, only without the blinking screens and endless coffee. So, the Sumerian invention of the receipt, by meticulously recording the exchange of goods and services against standardized units of value like barley and silver, played a crucial, albeit indirect, role in the evolution of money. It fostered the abstraction of value, enabled a more efficient marketplace, formalized credit, and laid the conceptual groundwork for later monetary systems. It was the quiet architect of financial systems, transforming tangible commodities into abstract units of wealth, one carefully inscribed clay tablet at a time. Their receipts literally coined money. You are now exploring the psychological and social implications of a receipt-driven society on the individual Sumerian. Imagine the subtle shift in human behavior and perception when every significant transaction, every obligation, every contribution is potentially recorded and made permanent. This is a mainstream historical fact. The widespread adoption of writing, even for mundane purposes, inevitably changes how people interact with their world and each other, fostering a more precise, accountable, and perhaps less informal way of life. Consider the sense of security. If you were a farmer delivering your grain to the temple, receiving a receipt provided a tangible proof of your contribution. This eliminated the fear of forgetfulness or dishonesty on the part of the temple administrators. It instilled a sense of fairness and trust in the system. Your labor was acknowledged, your contribution recorded. This was a psychological relief, reducing anxiety and fostering cooperation within the community. It was the original peace of mind document, ensuring your efforts would not be forgotten. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Some scholars suggest that the act of literally signing a receipt by impressing a personal cylinder seal fostered a stronger sense of individual agency and personal responsibility in transactions, as your unique mark was tied to the agreement. This physical act of authentication deepened the personal commitment to the recorded terms. Imagine the solemnity of rolling your personal seal across a wet clay tablet, knowing that impression was your promise, etched for all to see. Historians still argue whether the increased formalization of transactions through receipts led to a decrease in personal trust and reliance on oral agreements, or if it simply provided a more robust framework for trust in a rapidly expanding and increasingly anonymous urban environment. Did it diminish the handshake, or strengthen the foundation upon which handshakes could still be made? Regardless, the shift towards documented agreements was a fundamental change in how individuals interacted within their economic and legal spheres. You can appreciate the reduction in ambiguity and potential for dispute. Before receipts, arguments over quantities, dates, or terms of agreements would be common. Now, with a written record, there was an objective arbiter. This reduced friction in daily interactions and allowed individuals to navigate their economic lives with greater clarity. It was the original get it in writing culture, and it saved a lot of headaches, and probably a few fistfights too. The concept of personal credit history also subtly emerged. Mainstream historical fact, while not formalized as a credit score, records of loans and repayments on receipts would have informally tracked an individual's financial reliability. Those with good repayment records would likely find it easier to secure future loans or favorable terms in trade. This provided an incentive for financial responsibility and diligence. Your ancient receipts were essentially your ancient credit report, influencing your future financial opportunities. Imagine a young craftsman starting his business. His initial small loans and their prompt repayment, documented on clay tablets, would slowly build his reputation and allow him to access larger amounts of capital as his business grew. The receipt, in this sense, was a tool for individual advancement and economic mobility, enabling individuals to build their financial standing over time. It was the original proven track record, demonstrating your reliability through meticulous documentation. The shift towards written records also had a subtle impact on memory. While the burden of remembering every detail was lessened, the cognitive function of understanding and interpreting written information became paramount. Mainstream historical fact. The human brain adapted to this new form of information processing, learning to extract meaning from abstract symbols rather than relying solely on auditory cues and contextual memory. The receipt was a training ground for this new form of cognitive engagement. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Some scholars suggest that the widespread use of receipts and other administrative documents might have subtly influenced Sumerian storytelling and oral traditions, leading to more structured narratives and a greater emphasis on chronological sequence, mirroring the order and precision found in their written records. The logic of the ledger might have seeped into the logic of the legend. So, the Sumerian receipt, far from being a cold, impersonal artifact, had a profound psychological and social impact on the individual. It fostered a sense of security, reduced ambiguity, promoted accountability, influenced personal credit, and even subtly reshaped cognitive processes. It was a silent, yet powerful, force in shaping the daily lives and interpersonal relationships of ancient Sumerians, helping them navigate a complex and evolving world with greater confidence and clarity. It was literally writing their lives. You are now delving into the role of specialized tools and materials in the creation and permanence of Sumerian receipts. Imagine a scribe's toolkit, a surprisingly simple yet incredibly effective collection of items, essential for the daily grind of record keeping. This is a mainstream historical fact. The primary tools were readily available and inexpensive, making the technology of writing accessible across the vast Sumerian landscape. The receipt's widespread adoption was, in part, due to the ease with which it could be produced. The fundamental material, of course, was clay, abundant along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But not just any clay. It had to be pliable enough to be easily shaped and inscribed when wet, yet durable enough to harden and preserve the marks when dried. scribes would carefully select and prepare their clay, often needing it to remove impurities and achieve the desired consistency. This was a crucial first step, ensuring the quality of the paper for their ancient receipts. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that the very terroir of Mesopotamia, its specific mud composition, was a key enabler of written history. Imagine your tax forms being made from the dirt in your backyard. Historians still argue whether the specific types of clay used for tablets were intentionally refined and processed to optimize for writing, or if scribes simply used the most suitable clay found locally. Was it a deliberate technological development or a pragmatic choice based on natural availability? Regardless, the suitability of Mesopotamian clay for permanent record keeping was a fortunate environmental circumstance that profoundly impacted the course of human history. The stylus, the instrument used for inscribing the cuneiform signs, was typically a reed, cut and shaped to create the distinctive wedge-shaped impressions. The specific angle and pressure applied to the stylus would produce different marks, requiring skill and precision from the scribe. Mainstream historical fact: the evolution of cuneiform signs, from more curvilinear pictographs to the angular wedges, was partly driven by the efficiency of using a straight-edged stylus, making the writing process faster and more standardized. It was literally tool-driven language evolution, a subtle form of ancient ergonomic design. You can appreciate the simplicity and sustainability of this technology. No complex machinery, no rare metals, no elaborate manufacturing processes. The tools were organic, locally sourced, and easily replenished. This democratized the basic act of record keeping, allowing it to flourish in diverse settings, from grand temple archives to individual merchant houses. It was the original green technology, long before anyone knew what that term meant, and certainly more sustainable than today's endless paper receipts. Imagine a scribe preparing a tablet for a new receipt. They would take a lump of wet clay, pat it into a smooth, often rectangular or pillow shape, and then begin to inscribe it with their reed stylus. The marks would be clear and deep, ensuring they remained legible once the clay dried. It was a hands-on, tactile process, connecting the scribe directly to the material and the information being recorded. It was a physical act of creation, literally shaping knowledge with your hands. The process of drying and hardening the tablets was also crucial. Mainstream historical fact: while many administrative tablets were simply sun-dried, making them somewhat fragile, important legal documents and permanent records were often baked in kilns, making them extremely durable and resistant to water damage or erosion. This deliberate act of firing ensured the permanence of critical receipts, protecting them for millennia. It was their version of saving a file to a permanent, read-only format. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some very large and complex administrative tablets might have been inscribed in sections, or even by multiple scribes, and then carefully joined together before drying or firing, creating a composite record. This suggests a collaborative approach to large-scale data entry, and a sophisticated understanding of how to manage and assemble multi-part documents. It was like their version of cloud collaboration, but with a lot more physical assembly required. So, the Sumerian receipt was not just an abstract concept, it was deeply intertwined with the specific tools and materials available to them. The abundance of suitable clay, the simplicity of the reed stylus, and the mastery of firing techniques allowed for the widespread production and preservation of these crucial records. This practical infrastructure for writing was as important as the intellectual breakthrough of the script itself, demonstrating that technological ingenuity, even in its most basic forms, is fundamental to the development and success of complex societies. Their receipts were literally crafted from the earth, and they endure. You are now contemplating the social stratification inherent in the Sumerian receipt system, particularly the distinction between the literate and the illiterate. Imagine a society where the ability to read and write was not a universal skill, but a specialized trade, often passed down through families. This created a profound divide between those who could access and manipulate written information and those who could not. This is a mainstream historical fact. Literacy in ancient Sumer was limited to a small elite, primarily scribes, priests, and some members of the ruling class. For the vast majority of the population, including farmers, laborers, and many merchants, receipts were tangible objects that they received, but whose detailed content they could not independently verify. They relied on the honesty and integrity of the scribes and administrators. This created a power imbalance. where those who could read and write held a significant advantage in economic, legal, and administrative matters. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that the possession of a receipt, even if its contents were incomprehensible to you, still conferred a sense of legitimacy and peace of mind, based on trust in the system and the authority of the scribes. Historians still argue whether the limited spread of literacy was a deliberate strategy by the ruling class to maintain control over information and power, or if it was simply a practical consequence of the complexity of the cuneiform script and the resources required for its mastery. Was it a calculated means of social control, or an unavoidable outcome of technological difficulty? Regardless, the concentration of literacy had profound implications for social mobility and the distribution of power. You can appreciate the reliance on intermediaries. If you were an illiterate farmer, you would depend on a scribe to accurately record your grain delivery or your tax payment. If there was a dispute, you would again rely on a scribe to read and interpret the relevant tablet. This created a vital role for the scribal class, making them indispensable to the functioning of daily life for the average Sumerian. They were the original trusted third parties, mediating the world of written information for the majority. Imagine the frustration of an illiterate individual trying to understand a complex legal document or a detailed trade agreement. They would be entirely at the mercy of the scribe's interpretation. This highlights the ethical responsibility placed upon scribes to act with integrity and fairness, as they held immense power over the lives and livelihoods of others. It was a system that relied heavily on professional ethics, even in the absence of widespread literacy. The mainstream historical fact is that the scribal profession was often a pathway to social advancement, particularly for those from less privileged backgrounds who demonstrated exceptional intellectual aptitude. While often hereditary, the schools did accept and train individuals who showed promise, offering a rare avenue for upward mobility in a largely stratified society. Becoming a scribe was not just a job. It was a climb up the social ladder, an escape from the toil of the fields, all thanks to the ability to make meaningful marks in mud. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Some Sumerian literary texts, often written by scribes, include cautionary tales about the dangers of illiteracy or the wisdom of those who master the written word, subtly reinforcing the value and power associated with their profession. These texts were propaganda for literacy, subtly encouraging future generations to pick up the stylus. So, the Sumerian receipt system, while an incredible administrative and economic innovation, also created and reinforced a distinct social hierarchy based on literacy. It underscored the power of information and the prestige of those who could control it. While the receipt brought order and accountability, it also highlighted the inherent inequalities in a society where access to knowledge was not universal, proving that even the most beneficial technologies can have complex social consequences. The receipts were literally writing their social order. You are now examining the specialized forms of receipts that extended beyond simple economic transactions, encompassing religious offerings, legal judgments, and even astronomical observations. Imagine the breadth of information that the Sumerians chose to record, revealing a profound commitment to documentation across all facets of their complex society. This is a mainstream historical fact. Cuneiform was not confined to mundane economic lists. It was also used for ritual texts, omens, astrological predictions, and intricate legal records. The receipt, in its expanded conceptual form, became a fundamental tool for organizing and understanding their world. Consider a receipt for a religious offering. A wealthy citizen might donate a certain number of sheep or measures of grain to the temple as an act of piety. This donation would be meticulously recorded on a clay tablet, not just as an economic transaction, but as a testament to their devotion, a record of their spiritual fulfillment. This is a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some of these offering receipts might even include specific prayers or dedications, blending the practical act of recording with the sacred intention of the donation. It was like getting a receipt for your soul's good deeds, a divine accounting system. Historians still argue whether the detailed recording of religious offerings was primarily for ensuring accountability within the temple administration, or if it was also believed to have a spiritual efficacy, demonstrating to the gods the precise measure of human devotion. Was it practical management or spiritual appeasement? Regardless, the meticulousness of these receipts shows how deeply integrated the act of documentation was with their religious life. You can appreciate how the Sumerians used these records to make sense of the cosmos, Mainstream historical fact Sumerian and later Mesopotamian astronomical texts, meticulously recording the movements of celestial bodies, were fundamentally observational receipts of natural phenomena. These long-term records allowed them to identify patterns, develop calendars, and even make rudimentary predictions, laying the groundwork for astronomy and mathematics. Their observations were their receipts from the universe, meticulously documented for future interpretation. Imagine a scribe meticulously noting the position of a specific star each night, or the precise timing of a lunar eclipse. Each observation was a data point, a receipt of a celestial event. Over decades and centuries, these individual receipts accumulated into a vast body of astronomical knowledge, demonstrating a scientific mindset driven by meticulous data collection. It was the original big data project, but focused on the heavens, not human shopping habits. The legal judgments recorded on clay tablets, essentially formalized legal receipts, also provided a structured way to understand their legal system. Mainstream historical fact. These tablets would detail the accusation, the evidence presented, the arguments made, and the final verdict, creating a comprehensive record of judicial proceedings. This allowed for the establishment of legal precedents and a more consistent application of justice. Their court records were literally their receipts for justice, documenting every step of the legal process. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some scholars have discovered tablets that appear to be dream interpretations or omens, meticulously recorded by scribes. While not receipts in the traditional sense, they represent a desire to document and categorize even intangible phenomena, reflecting a broader Sumerian impulse to bring order and understanding to all aspects of their existence through written records. It was like getting a receipt for your subconscious, a documented attempt to understand the mysteries of the mind. So, the Sumerian concept of the receipt, initially born from economic necessity, expanded its reach to encompass a vast array of human experience, from the sacred to the scientific, from the legal to the philosophical. It became a versatile tool for organizing knowledge, understanding the world, and imposing order on the complexities of life. It demonstrates how a fundamental innovation in one sphere can have far-reaching and unexpected impacts across an entire civilization, proving that the desire to record and understand was as fundamental to the Sumerians as the desire to trade and build. Their receipts were literally writing their understanding of the world. You are now immersed in the practical day-to-day challenges faced by ancient Sumerian scribes, the unsung heroes of the receipt system. Imagine the intense focus required, the meticulous hand-eye coordination, and the sheer mental effort involved in their work. This was a demanding profession, requiring not just intellectual prowess, but also considerable physical dexterity and endurance. This is a mainstream historical fact. Scribal training was long and arduous, and the daily work involved repetitive, detailed tasks for extended periods. Consider the material challenges. Keeping the clay at the right consistency was critical. Too dry, and it would crack. Too wet, and the stylus would sink too deeply, or the marks would blur. Scribes had to work quickly, but carefully, especially when inscribing larger tablets that might take hours to complete. This required a keen understanding of their medium, a tactile intuition for the perfect pliability of clay. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that the feel of the clay under the scribe's fingers was as important as the sharpness of their stylus for a clear and lasting inscription. They were sculptors of data, working with a living, changing medium. Historians still argue whether the high volume of errors found on some tablets, particularly those from early periods or from student exercises, reflects a general lack of precision in Sumerian society, or simply the immense difficulty of mastering such a complex writing system on a challenging medium. Was it an indication of relaxed standards, or a testament to the sheer human effort involved in achieving accuracy? Regardless, the process was far from error-free, and corrections were often made by smoothing over sections of clay and reinscribing them. You can appreciate the physical toll of the work. Imagine sitting hunched over a clay tablet for hours, pressing a stylus into the damp surface, making thousands of tiny, precise wedge-shaped marks. The repetitive motions could lead to hand cramps, eye strain, and back pain. This was not a desk job in the modern sense. It was a physically demanding craft. It was the original keyboard warrior, but with much more literal muscle strain. The sheer volume of records was also a challenge. Mainstream historical fact. In larger administrative centers, thousands of receipts and other documents would be generated daily. Scribes had to not only create these records, but also categorize them, label them, and file them correctly within the archives. This required a high degree of organization and attention to detail, preventing the meticulous work of inscription from being lost in a chaotic filing system. It was the original data entry and data management, all done by hand, and with the threat of literally losing the records if they dried incorrectly. Imagine the pressure on a scribe responsible for recording a major transaction, say, the delivery of a massive quantity of grain to the temple. Any error in the numbers or a misinscribed name could lead to significant financial disputes or administrative headaches. The responsibility was immense and accuracy was paramount. It was a high-stakes job where a misplaced wedge could cost a lot of barley. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Some tablets have been found with scribal notes or colophons at the end, identifying the scribe who wrote the tablet, the date, and sometimes even a brief prayer or a comment about the difficulty of the task. These personal touches offer a rare glimpse into the human experience of ancient scribes, highlighting their pride in their work and the challenges they faced. It was like their version of an artist's signature, a personal mark on their ancient creations. So, while we often focus on the intellectual breakthroughs of the Sumerian receipt, it is important to remember the human element, the daily grind of the scribes who brought this system to life. Their dedication, skill, and physical endurance were essential for the creation and maintenance of this vast network of information. The Sumerian receipt was not just an invention. It was a monumental human endeavor, meticulously crafted, one careful stroke at a time, by those who devoted their lives to the mastery of mud and meaning. Their receipts were literally built by hand. You are now examining the economic value chain that was created and optimized by the Sumerian receipt system. Imagine tracing the journey of a single bushel of barley from the field, through the temple storehouse, to its final distribution as rations or trade goods. At each step, a receipt, or some form of recorded documentation, would be generated, creating a continuous, verifiable chain of custody and accountability. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Sumerian economy, particularly the temple economy, was a highly integrated and managed system, relying on precise record keeping at every stage of production and distribution. Consider the farmer delivering his harvest. He receives a receipt for his barley. This receipt allows the temple to track the inflow of resources. The barley is then stored, and inventory receipts are updated. When a portion of that barley is allocated to a baker for bread production, another receipt is generated, tracking the outflow. When the baker delivers the bread, another receipt tracks that input. This continuous flow of documentation created a transparent and auditable system, from raw material to finished product. It was the original supply chain management, meticulously tracked on clay. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Some administrative texts have been found that detail specific recipes or formulas for producing goods, such as beer or bread, often specifying the exact quantities of ingredients to be used. These could be seen as a form of production receipt, ensuring consistency and quality, and allowing administrators to calculate resource consumption accurately. It was like having a written recipe on your ancient production line, ensuring every batch was perfect. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for such detailed tracking of the value chain was purely economic efficiency, or if it also served a purpose in preventing fraud and ensuring fairness to all participants in the complex system. Was it about profit maximization or ethical governance? Regardless, the meticulous nature of their documentation highlights a sophisticated understanding of resource management and accountability throughout the entire production process. You can appreciate the reduction of waste and inefficiency this system allowed. By precisely tracking inputs and outputs at every stage, administrators could identify bottlenecks, optimize processes, and minimize losses due to spoilage or theft. This level of granular control was crucial for maximizing the productivity of their agricultural and industrial sectors. It was the original lean manufacturing, only with less emphasis on automation and more on careful record keeping. Imagine the immense task of auditing this ancient value chain. An administrator could pull out a series of linked receipts, tracing a specific quantity of grain from the field to its eventual consumption. This ability to audit provided a powerful mechanism for control and oversight, ensuring that resources were being utilized as intended and that the system was functioning efficiently. It was the original audit trail, allowing them to track every single item from source to destination. The concept of cost accounting also subtly emerged from this detailed tracking. Mainstream historical fact: by recording the inputs, labor, raw materials and outputs, finished goods of various production processes, Sumerian administrators could implicitly assess the cost of producing certain items, even if they did not use modern financial terms. This information would have been invaluable for making economic decisions, such as whether to produce goods internally or acquire them through trade. Their receipts were literally their cost accounting ledgers, allowing them to understand the economics of production. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some tablets contain records of disputes or investigations into discrepancies in the value chain, where scribes would meticulously cross-reference multiple receipts to identify where a loss or error occurred. These investigative reports highlight the proactive measures taken to maintain the integrity of their economic system, reinforcing trust and accountability. It was like their version of forensic accounting, painstakingly tracking every anomaly. So, the Sumerian receipt system was not just about individual transactions. It was about building and optimizing an entire economic value chain. It enabled precise tracking of resources, ensured accountability at every stage of production, and facilitated efficient management of a complex agricultural and industrial economy. It was the silent engine of their economic infrastructure, meticulously documenting the flow of wealth and resources, literally fueling their civilization's prosperity from field to temple. Their receipts were the threads that wove together their entire economy. You are now envisioning the Sumerian receipt as a precursor to modern data management and information technology. Imagine a world without computers, where the fundamental principles of data storage, retrieval, and analysis were being invented using clay and reed. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Sumerian administrative systems, driven by the need for receipts, represent one of humanity's earliest and most comprehensive attempts at large-scale information management. They were the original data scientists without the benefit of algorithms or spreadsheets. Consider the sheer volume of data generated. Tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands, of clay tablets have been unearthed from Sumerian sites, each a piece of information, a record. Managing this immense dataset required systematic organization. The Sumerians developed methods of cataloging, labeling, and shelving tablets, effectively creating rudimentary databases and archiving systems. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that some of these ancient databases even had specific indices or finding aids, tablets that listed the contents of other tablets or sections of an archive, allowing for more efficient retrieval of information. It was their version of a search engine. Only you had to physically browse through thousands of clay tablets to find what you were looking for. Historians still argue whether the development of increasingly complex record-keeping systems was a conscious process of technological innovation, or if it was more a pragmatic response to the ever-growing demands of a complex bureaucracy. Was it a deliberate pursuit of information technology, or an emergent property of persistent problem-solving? Regardless, the sophisticated nature of their data management demonstrates an impressive understanding of the principles of information organization. You can appreciate the concept of metadata emerging in these ancient records. Beyond the transactional details, receipts often included information about the date, the scribe, the specific department involved, and even the type of transaction. This additional information, or metadata, was crucial for organizing the vast archives and for retrieving relevant records efficiently. It was the original tagging system, allowing them to categorize and search their data effectively. Imagine a Sumerian administrator needing to find all receipts related to a specific type of grain delivery from a particular year. Without metadata, they would have to read every single tablet. With proper labeling and indexing, they could quickly narrow down their search, saving immense amounts of time and labor. This demonstrates an early understanding of the importance of structured data for efficient information retrieval. They were designing user interfaces, albeit with their limitations. The mainstream historical fact is that the development of writing systems, including cuneiform, inherently involved the creation of data structures. The signs themselves, their order, and their relationship to each other formed a structured way of representing information. The receipts, by virtue of their standardized format and consistent use of signs, embodied these early data structures, paving the way for more complex forms of information encoding. Their receipts were literally their data models, organizing information into a readable format, a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some scholarly analyses suggest that the Sumerian practice of creating lexical lists lists of cuneiform signs with their meanings and pronunciations, was not just for scribal training, but also served as a kind of data dictionary for their written records, ensuring consistency in terminology and understanding across different texts and departments. It was like their version of a glossary, or a technical manual for their ancient information systems. So, the Sumerian receipt, born from the simple need to track transactions, was a powerful catalyst for the development of fundamental principles of data management and information technology. It led to the creation of rudimentary databases, archiving systems, and metadata practices demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of how to organize, store, and retrieve vast amounts of information in a pre-digital age. It was the silent architect of ancient information systems, proving that the roots of your digital world stretch back to the dusty archives of ancient Sumer. Their receipts were literally the first bytes of data. You are now examining the concept of trust and its embodiment in the Sumerian receipt. Imagine a society grappling with the challenge of building economic and social trust in the absence of universally recognized currency or complex legal enforcement mechanisms. The receipt, in its most fundamental form, served as a tangible manifestation of an agreement, a concrete symbol of shared understanding and mutual obligation. This is a mainstream historical fact. In economies without formal institutions to enforce contracts, verifiable records play a crucial role in fostering trust and facilitating exchange. Before receipts, trust was largely personal, based on reputation and direct knowledge of individuals. As communities grew and trade expanded, this personal trust became insufficient. The receipt provided an impersonal, objective basis for trust. It was not about trusting the individual anymore. It was about trusting the system, the written record, and the authority that stood behind it. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that the very act of impressing a cylinder seal onto a clay receipt, thereby authenticating it with a unique personal mark, transferred a form of personal trust into the document itself, making the document the trusted entity rather than just the individual. Historians still argue whether the development of the receipt system primarily emerged from an inherent human desire for fairness and accountability, or if it was a practical necessity driven by the increasing anonymity of urban life and the need to mitigate the risks of fraud and dispute. Was it about moral principles or pragmatic risk management? Regardless, the function of the receipt in building and maintaining trust in a complex society is undeniable. You can appreciate the reduction of uncertainty. When you had a receipt, you had proof. This certainty reduced the need for constant vigilance and suspicion in transactions. It allowed for greater economic fluidity and reduced the psychological burden of constantly having to remember and verify every single agreement. It was the original proof of purchase, removing doubt and fostering confidence in the marketplace. Imagine a situation where a loan was made between two parties who did not know each other intimately. Without a receipt, the lender would face a significant risk of non-repayment. With a detailed loan receipt, the lender had a verifiable claim, and the borrower had a clear understanding of their obligation. This formalization of credit, supported by the receipt, expanded the pool of potential lenders and borrowers, stimulating economic activity. It was the original credit agreement, fostering financial trust across a broader community. The mainstream historical fact is that the concept of legal precedent also contributed to this building of trust. When disputes were resolved based on written records and past judgments, it created a predictable and consistent legal framework. This predictability, in turn, fostered trust in the legal system itself, knowing that disputes would be resolved based on evidence, rather than arbitrary decisions. The receipts were the building blocks of a trusted legal system, proving that consistency breeds confidence. A quirky or fringe tidbit, some scholars suggest that the repetitive nature of administrative tasks, including receipt generation, instilled a broader societal value for order, precision, and adherence to established procedures, which further contributed to a culture of trust. The daily practice of accurate record keeping subtly shaped societal expectations for honesty and reliability. It was like their version of practice makes perfect, where perfecting their receipts indirectly perfected their societal trust. So, the Sumerian receipt was not just a tool for tracking economic transactions. It was a fundamental mechanism for building and maintaining trust in a complex, urbanizing society. It transformed interpersonal trust into systemic trust, reduced uncertainty, formalized agreements, and provided a basis for a more predictable and fair legal system. It was the silent guardian of integrity, meticulously etched into clay, proving that the foundation of a stable society often rests on the ability to verify and prove. Their receipts literally built trust. You are now reflecting on the long-term historical impact of the Sumerian receipt as a foundational element for the development of modern accounting and financial practices. Imagine the centuries and millennia that separate the simple clay tablet from your intricate digital spreadsheets and blockchain transactions. Yet, the conceptual lineage is clear, a direct line of inheritance from the ancient world to the modern financial landscape. This is a mainstream historical fact. The fundamental principles of debit and credit, inventory management, and financial accountability can all trace their conceptual roots back to the meticulous record-keeping pioneered by the Sumerians. Consider the Sumerian system of tracking inflows and outflows of resources. While not formal double-entry bookkeeping, which emerged much later, the underlying principle of balancing accounts, ensuring that what came in was accounted for against what went out, was demonstrably present in their administrative texts. The receipts were the individual entries in these ancient ledgers, allowing for a rudimentary form of financial reconciliation. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that some Sumerian tablets even show evidence of basic audits, where two different sets of records were compared to ensure accuracy and identify discrepancies, demonstrating an early understanding of verification processes. They were the original accountants without the fancy software, but with all the fundamental ideas. Historians still argue whether the development of these advanced accounting principles was a spontaneous innovation driven by practical needs, or if it was the result of a deliberate, intellectual refinement of their existing record-keeping practices by the scribal class. Was it an accidental discovery or a conscious invention? Regardless, the intellectual groundwork laid by the Sumerians was crucial for the eventual development of sophisticated financial systems across the globe. You can appreciate how the standardization and systematic nature of Sumerian receipts laid the groundwork for broader financial systems. When every transaction, regardless of its specific content, is recorded in a consistent format with clear quantities and participants, it creates a dataset that can be aggregated, analyzed, and managed. This systematic approach to financial information was a revolutionary step, paving the way for the complex financial instruments and institutions of the modern world. It was the original financial data standardization, making the global economy of tomorrow possible. Imagine the leap from a personal memory of a transaction to a written, verifiable record. This transformation allowed for the accumulation of wealth beyond immediate consumption, the financing of large-scale enterprises, and the creation of credit markets. The receipt, in its foundational role, enabled these economic advancements, demonstrating how a simple tool can facilitate monumental economic growth. It was the original paper trail that led to the creation of capital markets. The mainstream historical fact is that the very concept of a ledger, or a register, for financial transactions, which is central to all modern accounting, is directly traceable to the Sumerian practice of organizing their clay tablets. Whether it was a basket of related receipts or a sequential series of transactions inscribed on a single tablet, the idea of a centralized, organized record of financial activity originated in Sumer. They were literally inventing the concept of a financial record book, a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some scholars have even suggested that the detailed Sumerian astronomical tables, which were used for predicting celestial events, influenced their meticulous approach to financial forecasting, demonstrating an early cross-pollination of scientific and economic methodologies. The precision used for predicting the stars might have subtly influenced their precision in predicting markets, or at least harvests. So, the Sumerian invention of the receipt was far more than a historical curiosity. It was a foundational milestone in the long and complex history of accounting, finance, and information management. It laid the conceptual and practical groundwork for principles that underpin your entire economic world, from your personal bank statement to the global stock market. It was the silent, ancient architect of financial systems, proving that the roots of modern commerce stretch back to the dusty archives of Sumer, meticulously documented on clay. Their receipts were literally the original financial blueprints. You are now at the culmination of our journey, standing at the edge of the ancient Sumerian world, gazing back at the profound simplicity and immense power of the receipt. Imagine the countless hands that shaped these humble clay tablets, the scribes who patiently pressed their styluses, and the silent, enduring testament to their ingenuity. This is a mainstream historical fact, the Sumerian invention of writing, driven primarily by the need for record keeping and exemplified by the receipt, is one of the most significant intellectual achievements in human history, fundamentally reshaping society, economy, and thought. The receipt, in its essence, was a solution to a problem of scale. How do you manage a growing population, a complex economy, and a sophisticated administration without forgetting, without dispute, without chaos? The answer lay in tangible, verifiable documentation. It allowed for the allocation of resources, the tracking of labor, the formalization of contracts, and the establishment of trust in an increasingly interconnected world. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit that the very concept of receipt, as a physical proof of a transaction, is so deeply ingrained in human consciousness that it transcends millennia, a testament to its universal utility and enduring power. Historians still argue whether the invention of the receipt was a single, revolutionary flash of genius, or a gradual, evolutionary process of countless small innovations and adaptations driven by daily necessity. Was it a sudden breakthrough, or a slow and steady accumulation of practical solutions? Regardless of its precise origin, its impact was transformative, laying the intellectual and practical foundations for civilizations that would follow. You can appreciate the simplicity of its genius. No complex machinery, no elaborate infrastructure, just mud and a reed. Yet with these basic tools, the Sumerians built a system of information management that allowed them to coordinate massive public works, manage vast agricultural surpluses, administer justice, and engage in long-distance trade. The receipt was the humble cornerstone of this complex edifice, the silent engine of their civilization. It was the original low-tech, high-impact innovation, proving that sometimes the simplest ideas are the most powerful. Imagine a world without receipts, without any verifiable record of transactions. It would be a chaotic, distrustful, and ultimately unsustainable place for complex societies to flourish. The Sumerians, through their invention and widespread adoption of the receipt, provided the essential scaffolding for organized human interaction beyond the most rudimentary levels. They effectively created the first shared, objective memory for their society, allowing them to build upon past experiences and plan for the future. It was the original memory stick for their civilization, but it was made of clay. The mainstream historical fact is that the Sumerian receipt system not only facilitated their own remarkable achievements, but also provided a template for all subsequent administrative and financial systems in the ancient world and beyond. The concepts of recording, archiving, auditing, and establishing accountability, born from the simple receipt, are still fundamental to how your modern world operates. The echoes of Sumerian efficiency and precision resonate in every bank statement, every legal document, and every digital transaction you encounter today. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Some scholars suggest that the Sumerian reverence for scribes and the written word, particularly evidenced in their literary texts glorifying the act of writing, was not just about the beauty of the script, but also a profound recognition of the existential importance of their administrative records, their receipts, for the very survival and flourishing of their civilization. It was like their version of celebrating their accountants, recognizing that accurate record keeping was vital for their collective well-being. So the Sumerian invention of the receipt, humble though it may be, was a monumental step in human history. It was the quiet, yet powerful, catalyst that transformed chaotic communities into organized cities, simple bartering into complex economies, and ephemeral memories into enduring historical records. It was the silent architect of accountability, the unseen engine of trust, and the unassuming foundation upon which the very concept of written civilization was built. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound innovations come in the most unassuming forms, literally written in mud and enduring for all time. And now, as the ancient sun sets over the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, and the sounds of the bustling city begin to fade, allow yourself to drift. The whispers of ancient scribes, the soft tap of their styluses on clay, the rustle of barley being counted, all blend into a gentle hum. That little receipt, born of necessity, grew into a giant, silently underpinning the rise of empires, the flow of commerce, and the very structure of thought. It was the humble beginning of a journey that leads directly to the digital transactions you make every day. You can almost feel the weight of those ancient tablets, holding the promise of a documented world. Let the gentle echoes of Sumerian ingenuity lull you now, a reminder that even the smallest, most practical ideas can shape the grand narrative of human history. Sleep well, knowing that the roots of your world are deeply, firmly, and meticulously recorded in the ancient past.